We're good.
All right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our council meeting for Monday, November the 22nd, 2021. Before we get into our regular council agenda, we do have a committee of adjustment meeting to consider a couple of matters. So with that, we'll call the committee adjustment meeting to order. Tonight, we have a public meeting being held under section 45 sub 5 of the Planning Act to consider two minor variance applications. The first application, which is under file number A21-08, is for the property located at 393 Colonel Phillips Drive. The purpose and effect of this application is to request relief from section 5.68 of zoning bylaw number 38-2007 in order to construct a converted dwelling with a second dwelling in the cellar of the existing single detached dwelling. The application is seeking relief from the regulation which states that a dwelling unit shall not be located in the cellar of the dwelling. The second application, which is under file number A21-09, is for the property located at 649 Armstrong Road. And the purpose and effect of this application is to request relief from section 5.68 and section 4.3.3.2 sub 2 of zoning bylaw number 38-2007 in order to construct a converted dwelling with a second dwelling unit in the cellar of the existing single detached dwelling and to permit parking within the first 6 meters of the front property line for the purpose of satisfying the parking requirements. The application is seeking relief from the regulation which states that a dwelling unit shall not be located in the cellar of a dwelling and that required parking shall not be located within the required front yard. I will now ask the clerk for the method of notice for tonight's meeting.
Notice of tonight's public meeting was advertised in local media sources. Notice is posted on the town's website, and property owners within a 60-meter radius have received notification.
Thank you. So we'll have a brief presentation with respect to each application from our town planner, Steve Weaver. He will provide a summary of written comments received, and following each presentation, there will be an opportunity for members of the committee as well as members of the public who are signed on to ask questions or provide comments. Steve, good evening. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Good evening, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. So both applications tonight on the Committee of Adjustment agenda are very similar. So I'll maybe spend a bit more time going through the first one and be a bit shorter with the second. So the first one is 393 Colonel Phillips Drive. I'll just share my screen as I do have a few slides just to assist with the public meeting. Did that come up?
Yep.
Okay. So the first application was filed by the Mackenzies, residents of 393 Colonel Phillips Drive, in application number A2108. So both applications are in the Summerhill subdivision. The first is for a property located near the southeast corner of Johnson Drive and Colonel Phillips Drive. It's an existing single detached dwelling shown here on the air photo. It does have an attached 2-car garage and a 2-car wide driveway in the front yard. I know this is turned sideways, but this is the sketch that was provided by the applicant just to illustrate the siting of the home on the lot. This is straight from the subdivision files, and you can see that there's an existing single detached dwelling approximately 24 feet back from the front property line with a front yard driveway wide enough for 2 cars and then a double car garage for the 2 required parking spaces are proposed. So 1 space is required for the main dwelling and a second space needs to be provided for the second dwelling unit proposed. So the applicant provided an architectural floor plan for the proposed renovations to the lowest level of the dwelling. The lowest level is a pretty typical unfinished basement. However, for the zoning bylaw purposes, because most of its vertical height is below grade, it is defined as a cellar. And I know the committee has heard applications like this before. It's really a function of how the zoning bylaw defines basement and cellar. That's the reason for the requested variance. So the owner is essentially proposing a two-bedroom apartment in the basement. So a main rec room, kitchen, a couple bedrooms in this location, and a separate independent entrance from the side of the home with an exterior door in that location. And then the common utility room would be closed off in this location. So this is the illustration provided in the zoning bylaw, and really what's driving these types of applications currently is that the zoning bylaw defines a basement as illustrated on the right-hand graphic. And you can see that what it's showing is that a basement is defined as a lower level where the majority of the vertical height between the floor and ceiling is above the surrounding finished grade. So not really a traditional basement, but more of like a bungalow type design. And the drawing on the left illustrates what the basement defines as a cellar, which is where this dimension C is mostly below grade. This doesn't mean that you can't have a habitable space with a dwelling unit in the lower level from a building and fire code standpoint. It's simply the way the zoning bylaw has defined the two terms. So we did circulate the application in accordance with the Planning Act, and the results of that circulation are summarized in my report, which is included in the agenda package. Just give me a moment while I refer back to my report. So we didn't receive any concerns or objections regarding the application. The building department confirmed no concerns from a building code perspective. They confirmed that a building permit will be required. The county's planning consultants did identify on some mapping that there was a woodlot located to the west. However, any impacts related to that woodlot were addressed as part of the subdivision development at the time when these homes were constructed. So there's no environmental impact or related study required to address that. The county's planning consultants had also identified that consultation should occur with the Nottawasaga Valley Conservation Authority regarding source water protection. The NVCA risk management official confirmed there's no source water protection impacts related to the proposed unit. And then finally, the Director of Development and Operations has indicated no comments or concerns. So one of the chief considerations with these applications is the cumulative impact to servicing. Individually, each additional unit that's added within an existing home doesn't really have a major impact to servicing, but we've been having a number of these. So as a result of the special meeting in May of this year, a reserve was set up for the stage 1 area, which is really the existing built up part of the community, allowing for up to 10 cubic meters per day of wastewater capacity to be allocated to these types of infill and renovation projects. So to date, we have had 7 residential units approved under that reserve earlier this year. So those are listed in this table here, plus 1 commercial unit at 121 Adeline. The one at Main Street has been built, the one at Halbert Drive as well. We're still awaiting a building permit application on 105 Mill Street, and we did establish a 1-year timeline on use of the allocation. And 121 Adeline is in the process of finalizing that site plan approval to build that multi-use building. So with the 2 applications tonight, that would, if approved, that would add 2 more units to the allocation, which simply means that of the 12 single or semi-detached unit equivalents or 30 apartment or other types of unit equivalents, we would be left with 8 single or semi-detached unallocated or 20 other or apartment units. The reason for the difference there is that there's a larger household size assumption for single and semi-detached in terms of the number of people who would live in the dwelling versus an apartment or other type of unit. So that is my presentation. We didn't receive any public comments or objections regarding this application, but we are here tonight to entertain any public comments. And subject to that, we have recommended approval of the application, as it is similar to some previous applications that were approved for basement apartments. And it does conform with, in our view, with the town's official plan policies and meets the tests of a minor variance as outlined in our report.
Are there any questions from committee members? Member Bernardo?
Just a question on the single units versus apartment units. I have no questions on the actual unit itself, but just, Steve, what's the difference between that you would regulate more for apartment units when you can have a 2-bedroom apartment almost the same size as what that basement apartment is proposed? I'm sort of confused.
So a 2-bedroom apartment, whether it's in a existing home, through a basement renovation, or whether it's in a building downtown, we treat it the same for servicing allocation. Like the same household size is assumed. What I was trying to illustrate is that if someone were to build a brand new single detached home on a vacant lot, we would consider that as requiring more servicing than someone who's just renovating and adding a unit within an existing home.
Okay, so you said that there's 8 remaining units left or 20 apartment units, and that's where I got confused because they're, like you just told me, they're both similar, treated similarly. So where does the 20 apartment units come in?
So just put this back up. So the 10 cubic meters per day that is reserved for the stage 1 area, if we convert that based on household size factors, that would allow for up to 12 single or semi-detached units to be built. Or if it's apartments, it would allow up to 30. So the difference being that 12 units is multiplied by, I think it's 3.2 persons per unit. And other apartments, I think, is 1.5 persons per unit. So
So the apartment is smaller in consideration or less people than what you're considering in single or semi-detached units.
Yes. So basically, we're assuming that if all of the allocations are granted to apartments, that will have less servicing impact than if it was all granted to single and semi-detached units.
Okay.
So
So if somebody came forward on an empty lot and asked for a building permit to build on that empty lot, he would take up the single or semi-detached one of those 12 units.
exactly.
I got it. Thank you.
Member Wagner?
Thank you so much. So just to kind of, I guess, follow up off of Member Bonado's. So with an apartment this size, how are we still justifying it as a 1.5? We've got a 2-bedroom and it's pretty much the same size as the upper level of the house. So we could potentially see, more than 1.5 persons moving into something this large.
It's a good question. I mean, we're going to monitor that and make sure we don't over allocate. If we see mostly larger apartments being built or 2- and 3-bedroom apartments, you certainly get the higher range of the household size. But there's 2 things with that. So it's an average across all the apartments that have been built. So there have been some apartments approved in this mix that are only 1-bedroom or bachelor. And then the other thing is when you take the basement out of the equation for the single detached home, it is a bit of an offsetting there potentially, that you may have fewer people in the main level of the home than you otherwise might. So the overall impact of adding a unit in an existing home isn't quite the same as, say, building a brand new home as a result of that.
That's true. That's a good point, for sure. So so we're okay then with this allocation. I just don't want to, as Member Bernardo has stated in the past, we don't want to go too close to our sort of capacity limits. And then, you know, we have people who might be putting in illegal basement apartments and we don't know about them, right? So now we're over our capacity because other people are potentially not letting us know that they're putting in, you know, a second or third bathroom or another laundry room or something like that. And then we're stuck now over capacity, even though we think we're still okay. So I really just want to make sure that, you know, we're not going to be hanging ourselves, I guess you could say, for lack of a better term, you know, when we really, our first duty is to the members of the community as it stands right now, right? If we impact service to them, how is that fair in order to, you know, give someone else an added space in their dwelling?
Yeah, we're okay through you, Mr. Chairman. So we did come up with this 10 cubic meters per day as a, you know, a conservative limit to make sure that we weren't assigning too much to this kind of development and over allocate. This will need to be revisited again, at least, you know, once a year, maybe more often, to make sure that the actual flows observed at the plant aren't getting higher than we had expected they would based on the activity that's happening. So we do expect that in the first quarter of 2022, there will be a comprehensive full year analysis again of the 2021 observed flows and see what's happened. There's a lot of moving parts to that right now with people staying home more often, but in some cases transitioning back to work. We want to see what the impact of that is as well. But at this point in time, we're comfortable based on my discussion with the engineers with allocating within this 10 cubic meter per day limit. If we need to adjust that, have flexibility to adjust that upward or downward, or need to adjust it downward in the new year based on the updated analysis, we'll certainly advise on that. I guess the other point I wanted to make is all of these recommendations are based on the use it or lose it approach. So they will need to get a building permit and start that construction process within a year in order to maintain this allocation. So if some don't proceed, that would go back into the overall reserve.
That's awesome.
Oh, sorry.
No, I want to say thank you.
Just so I'm clear too, so even though the recommendation is that the committee approved this, it is based on two conditions. One being that allocation capacity is confirmed sort of, you know, before a building permit is pulled. And then secondly, as you just said, that the permit, you know, be obtained within a year's time. So that's good. You know, I guess that gives you guys the ability to sort of track this beyond tonight too. Yeah, and what we do then is we advise, you know, the applicant if the year is approaching and if they haven't started the permit process to get a building permit, that they would have to reapply for their allocation, and then we could reassess whether we still have capacity available at that time.
Okay. Sorry, can I ask one more quick question? How long, if you get a permit, how long are those permits good for? Because it's quite easy to get a permit before the year's not necessarily built.
I believe it's 6 months for a building permit for residential. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Are there any other questions from the committee? No. Madam Clerk, was there anybody from the public logged on?
No, sir. There are no members of the public in attendance for tonight's public meeting.
All right. So Steve's recommendation, as I said, is to grant approval for the minor variance. Is there anybody interested in making a motion in that regard? Member Donato, is there a seconder for that? Member Wagner? Okay, so the motion reads, be it resolved that the Committee of Adjustment receive report P 2021-46 for information, and that the Committee of Adjustment grants approval of minor variance application A2108 for the property municipally known as 393 Colonel Phillips Drive and legally described as Lot 70 on Plan 7M56 to permit a converted dwelling with the second dwelling unit located in the lower level of the existing dwelling, notwithstanding that the zoning bylaw does not permit a dwelling unit within a cellar as defined by the bylaw. And that is subject to the following two conditions. Number one, that the owner shall obtain confirmation of sufficient reserve servicing capacity by the town engineer for the stage 1 area, and allocation of servicing for the additional residential unit prior to municipal approval of a building permit. And number 2, that the owner shall obtain a building permit for the additional residential unit within 1 year of satisfying condition number 1, failing which the servicing allocation shall be revoked and this minor variant shall lapse unless the committee grants an extension prior to the expiry. Any discussion on that? All in favor? And that's carried. Okay. Steve, back to you.
Okay, and as I mentioned, this one is very similar to the first, so I'll go through it a little more quickly. The second application, A2109, applies to another property in the Summerhill subdivision, which is 649 Armstrong Road. And in this case, the property is located at the southeast corner of Armstrong Road and Galbraith Street, which backs on the existing park in the subdivision. So it is a corner lot. This is the sketch that the applicant provided. There is a bit different configuration of the parking in this variance application or in this property. So there is a single car garage attached to the existing home. And what they're proposing is that the second parking space required would be what's referred to as a tandem parking space. In other words, it would be in the front yard driveway in this location. Proposed floor plan, again, it's another 2-bedroom apartment in the lower level with a dining and living area. The utility room is separated. In this case, it would be a shared entrance through the existing home rather than having a separate entrance from the outside. I won't explain the difference between cellar and basement in the bylaw, but the same applies here. That's the one aspect of the variance, just to get relief from the definition of the cellar to allow a unit in the lower level of the house. And again, it's a space that can be finished to meet building code and fire code for a dwelling unit. And then the other aspect of the variance is to permit the tandem parking space in the front yard driveway. We just talked about this, so just highlighting the subject property for this application. Again, that adds one more unit to the allocation with the same conditions as just discussed, but that would have to be used within a year of being allocated by proceeding to a building permit. So we did circulate this application as well. There were no objections to the approval of the application. There was one question submitted by a neighboring resident or a resident of the area earlier today. The question was whether there would be any changes to the on-street parking permissions for this property specifically. And if that were to happen, how would that be enforced so that it can be monitored whether it's that actual unit holder parking on the street or somebody else? And the response was there's no on-street parking permission relief or change associated with this application. They still would not be able to park on the street overnight or during the winter time, during a snow event, and that all the parking has to be provided on the property itself. So we did respond to that question, and then there were no other comments or objections from that individual or from the public. But we're here again to receive comments tonight, and I believe the applicant is here on the meeting as well. So with that, I'll pause for any comments or questions from the committee.
Member Venato.
I got a question on the parking as well. When I looked at the drawing, tandem parking, that's great. What happens there if the owner upstairs has 2 vehicles and the downstairs resident has 2 vehicles? You've got 4 vehicles. Now you've got tandem parking where you've got 1 vehicle supposedly in a garage. I've never seen vehicles in garages because they're always full of junk. And 4 vehicles sitting there on a single car driveway. So I understand the residents' concern about parking. Where are these people going to park? On the lawn? Like, realistically, that's my concern with this type of tandem parking. Plus, with tandem parking, when you've got a car parked in the garage and a car parked in the driveway, and the owner wants to go out and the resident downstairs is parked in the driveway, what do? Go down, knock on the bedroom door and tell him to get the heck up so he can move his vehicle out of the way?
Through you, Mr. Chair. So all good questions. And there's really two ways of looking at this. One is the way of assessing whether it meets the rules and regulations that apply. And the other is the practicality of it. And you're speaking about the practicality of it. That's certainly more challenging. The bylaw only requires one parking space per unit. And in fact, that's a Planning Act stipulation in Ontario. The Planning Act stipulates that you can only require one parking space when somebody wants to add an additional unit to a home. So municipalities aren't allowed to say you have to add 2 more parking spaces or 3 more parking spaces or base it on the number of bedrooms or anything like that. And secondly, the province says in the Planning Act, you have to allow that second parking space to be provided in a tandem format, so that yes, there's the practical issue of one tenant having to ask the other tenant to move their car to get in and out. But the Planning Act was amended in 2019 to say municipalities, you have to allow that kind of parking configuration for these kinds of second units in homes. And the province has really been trying to, I would call it, relax those types of requirements so that as many people have the opportunity to do this sort of thing as possible to address some issues around affordability and lack of rental, and assisting the homeowner through rent income to help pay for the mortgage, those kinds of things. What it ends up with is if the tenants, the owner and the tenant, or the 2 tenants, have more cars than parking available, just like other residents in the community, it becomes a bylaw enforcement issue. And that's where the resource is needed, at the town to either react if in a complaint situation, or if there's parking on the street when maintenance activity is taking place, or against the town's bylaw. That's where the problems can arise. So it's not a perfect solution, but the regulatory environment does require municipalities to allow for it.
Okay, so when we allow for these homes, we allow for parking the way the homes are built with the driveways. Now suddenly we're putting in apartments into the homes, and the parking stays the same as when we allow for the home?
It does, because the zoning bylaw says if you're building a single detached home, you have to provide 1 parking space. And they have 2, as you can see on the plan. 1 is in the garage, which in fact is the required parking space under the bylaw. And then all they need relief from is the zoning bylaw requirement that says you can't have a required parking space in the required front yard. Of course, that's where everybody parks. So that's the nature of the variance. Now, the challenge is saying that that's not appropriate or against the intent of the bylaw, because the province in the Planning Act has said that has to be permitted. So we haven't caught up to that regulation with the zoning bylaw yet. When the zoning bylaw is updated, it will have to provide for that kind of parking arrangement by default. And so there wouldn't be a variance requirement for this kind of thing.
So our zoning bylaw, when we update it, can we change it for the amount of parking required in front of the houses to add more parking to the houses rather than less?
Yeah, so through you, Mr. Chairman, I think that's something we'll have to really look at, is what most municipalities are doing for the different unit types. What you can do is require 2 parking spaces for the home when it's built in the first place. So you can't require more than 1 for the new unit that gets added, but you can require 2 for the house to begin with. And then in that case, anyone who doesn't have more than 2 spaces or more room for 2 cars on the property wouldn't be able to do a converted unit unless they apply for a variance. So it'll come back to the committee, but in a different form. In both cases, we will require them to demonstrate that they have enough parking, but we can't require them to provide more than 1 unit for the 1 space for the new unit.
So it's our zoning bylaw that's really at fault right now.
In some respects, because it does only require the one for the original home. It does say it has to be a minimum of 6 meters back from the front lot line, so it's in the garage, but it doesn't require 2 per unit, which is kind of the industry standard in many municipalities. For a single detached home anyway, is to require 2 per unit, 2 per home.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Member Wagner?
Thank you. Yeah, so my concern is exactly the same as Member Bonato's. I think maybe the province also needs to look into how wide the streets can be in these new subdivisions as well, because we know that there's going to be parking on the road with regards to this this unit. Did I see it correctly that there's no external, like there's not a secondary door leading in from outside? It's only internal?
Through you, Mr. Chairman, that's correct. So there's no building or fire code requirement or zoning bylaw requirement to have a separate entrance. It can be through the other unit or through a common area.
Okay.
And, we did consult with the building department on that, and they confirmed that as long as you have the windows large enough in the basement for secondary means of egress, then which they will have, then you don't require the separate entrance.
Okay, so this is kind of more like an in-law suite.
Yeah.
Assuming.
That's correct.
And right now that's fine. That's wonderful. It's just resale wise is what I think, right? When it goes up on the market and someone else purchases it and they're like, I'm going to rent out both units. And then I guess at that point, maybe they'll have to assess whether they need to create a separate entrance. So, okay. Thank you so much.
Thank
you. Anybody else? And Madam Clerk, I'm assuming no members of the public signed in for this one either? No. Okay. All right. Well, the recommendation is quite similar to the last one. It is to grant the minor variance based upon the 2 same conditions. Is there anybody willing to move and second that? Okay, Member Anderson, is there a seconder? I'll second it. The motion reads as follows. Be it resolved that the Committee of Adjustment received report P 2021-47 for information, and that the Committee of Adjustment grants approval of minor variance application A2109 for the property municipally known as 649 Armstrong Road and legally described as Lot 133 on Plan 7M56 to permit a converted dwelling with the second dwelling unit located in the lower level of the existing dwelling, notwithstanding that the zoning bylaw does not permit a dwelling unit within a cellar as defined in the bylaw, and to permit parking within the first 6 meters of the front property line for the purposes of satisfying the parking requirements. And that is subject to the following 2 conditions. Number 1, that the owner shall obtain confirmation of sufficient reserve servicing capacity by the town engineer for the stage 1 area and allocation of servicing for the additional residential unit prior to municipal approval of a building permit. And number 2, that the owner shall obtain a building permit for the additional residential unit within 1 year of satisfying condition number 1, failing which the servicing allocation shall be revoked and this minor variance shall lapse unless the committee grants an extension prior to that expiry. The motion's on the floor. Is there any further discussion on it? All in favor? Opposed? That's carried. All right, Steve, is that it for this evening?
That's all for Committee of Adjustment. Thank you.
Can I get a motion to adjourn Committee of Adjustments? Member Hall, second by Member Fegan. All in favor? That's carried. Okay, so we'll call our regular council meeting to order. And to begin, I would ask that you stand and join us for the playing of the national anthem. This time, we would also like to acknowledge the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, including the Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and Chippewa, and the people of the Three Fires Confederacy. If any member of the council has a pecuniary interest to declare, it can be declared now or throughout the agenda as the matter arises. And just a reminder, any declarations have to be made verbally and in writing, be filed by the clerk. Don't see any. So moving on to minutes, can I get a motion to receive the minutes and approve the minutes from the regular council meeting held November the 8th? By Councillor Buffett, seconded by Councillor Bernardo. Any discussion on those? All in favor? Carried. Madam Clerk, were there any questions submitted for public question period?
No questions this evening.
Okay. So we do have one proclamation request from Family Transition Place, and that is for the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women. And that proclamation reads as follows. Whereas violence continues to be the greatest gender inequality rights issue for women, girls, and gender diverse individuals, and whereas November is Women Abuse Prevention Month, and whereas gender-based violence is a human right issue, which our community must work together to address, prevent, and address through public awareness and education, and whereas 1 in 3 women will experience gender-based violence in their lifetime, and these numbers increase exponentially for Black, Indigenous, and women of color, and whereas the COVID-19 pandemic has increased barriers to support and services for survivors of gender-based violence and their children, and whereas last year in Ontario, every 13 days, a woman or child was killed by a man known to them, with the majority being their current or former intimate partner. And whereas this month and throughout the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence, we acknowledge our community's support of the Wrapped in Courage campaign and commitment to ending gender-based violence. Now, therefore, I, Mayor Wade Mills, do hereby proclaim and declare that November 25th, 2021 shall be known as the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women, and urge all citizens to recognize this day by taking action to support survivors of gender-based violence and to become part of an Ontario-wide effort to end gender-based violence. So thank you to Family Transition Place for requesting that proclamation. And next up, we have a presentation from Optimus SBR, who are going to present our service delivery review. And I think Denise may have some introductory comments before we welcome Jesse and Cole.
Thank you, Mayor Mills. I just wanted to have the opportunity to introduce the consultants and the partners or the principals with the firm, Optimus. So we have Jesse Burns with us, as well as Cole Clement. Oh, sorry, Cole, I'm going to mess up your last name here. Clementini. I'll get it right yet. I apologize. So I just wanted to provide the background. As council knows, we didn't do a staff report for this, but we did receive a $70,000 grant from the ministry to support this initiative. The presentation tonight from the presenters is the culmination of months worth of work, including thank you to council for all of those of you who took your time to meet and be interviewed by the consultants. So they're going to walk you through this. There will be many recommendations that will be aligned with the 2022 draft budget, and the budget framework is something that we're presenting next week. And that was really important to have this presentation in advance of that framework being presented to you, and then following that, the budget. So I will then turn it over to Jesse and Cole.
Great. Thank you, Denise, and good evening, everyone. Thanks for having us tonight. It's good to see everyone again. So by way of introduction, as Denise mentioned, my name is Jesse Burns. I'm a senior manager here at Optimus and was the lead for this work. And I'm joined by my colleague, Cole Clementino, and Denise. It took me a long time to learn the pronunciation on that as well, so don't feel bad. But as you know, and as Denise just mentioned, we've been working with the town to conduct the service delivery review, and would like to take this evening to provide an overview of our findings and specifically the recommendations that have been developed. So by way of an agenda, we'll take the next hour or so, including questions and any comments, to go through the report, and I'll talk a bit about the context of the project, and then Cole is going to summarize some of the current state findings. Part of the work included a detailed current state review of the services that the town provides, and Cole is going to talk through some of the themes that we heard. I'll then walk through some of the recommendations that have been developed, and we'll get into specific services, and I'll give a bit more background, but again, most of the details are included in the full report that was distributed last week, and tonight we do want to really take the opportunity to focus on the recommendations and the path forward, but certainly happy to discuss any elements of that document, and I will explain the details as they pertain to the recommendations when we go through that. I'll also take a bit of time to talk about some implementation considerations for the recommendations, and then, as I mentioned, we'll have time for any comments or questions from council. In terms of our objectives for the meeting, just to be very clear in line to what I just mentioned, we want to give an update of the activities that we've completed. We want to summarize what we heard with respect to the current state. We'll outline the recommendations for the town moving forward, and we'll provide that opportunity for any questions or feedback from council. So then jumping really right into it, did want to start with a bit of context. I'll say a few words and then I'll pass to Cole to walk through some of the current state summary. And this builds on what Denise had just mentioned in her introduction, but the review does build on a lot of recent work and activity from across the town. The town has planned to conduct an SDR for a while now, and because of the county-wide SDR, which was conducted last year, I believe there was a decision to wait until that review was complete before Shelburne focused on its own SDR. And the work of this project is obviously that SDR. And as Denise mentioned, the project was funded through a grant from the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing, part of the Modernization Fund. And I do know that the town is very appreciative of that funding. There's been a few drivers around why the town has decided to complete this review. And those are, I think, important to reiterate at the start of this discussion. And they do predate COVID, but can generally be summed up as a result of some significant population growth in the town and the corresponding increases to services and changes in service demands. And certainly this came through in conversations with members of council. New residents are placing an increase on not just the volume, but the types of services that are provided. There's an increasing variety of services that the community is looking for. And it's important to understand if the town is providing these in the best possible way, and if the town is positioned to provide these into the future. And the report highlights examples around parks and arts and culture and recreation as examples. One note that I'll mention before Cole jumps in, the 2020 SDR for the County of Dufferin and the member municipalities did include recommendations related to the boards of management for fire and indoor recreational services, and that there were recommendations around changing the service provision of those services. The original scope of this SDR did give a consideration to exploring potential impact of those recommendations and the potential impact of the town delivering either of those services. However, as consultations between Shelburne and neighboring municipalities involved in those boards of management are ongoing, detailed planning considerations were not included in this review, and rather we've included the consideration that there's a potential for new services into the future, as opposed to recommendations based on any sort of an agreed timeline or MOU or assumed decision. So we have not made assumptions in that regard, but nonetheless, the overall findings and themes would reflect an ability to potentially consider those into the future. With that, I'll hand over to Cole to walk through a few slides around the current state, and then, a few slides about the SDR process and the current state. So Cole, do you want to jump in?
Thanks, Jesse. Appreciate it. Yeah, so as Jesse mentioned, we'll go through a bit about SDRs before we jump into a summary of the current state findings. So really starting with what is a service delivery review. They are a very common exercise for municipalities to undertake, and they provide the opportunity for municipalities to gauge their current level of service delivery to their constituents and also identify opportunities to operate more efficiently and more effectively meet the needs of the residents in the community. So those are generally what a service delivery review is all about and why you do them. Well, within the context of the town, there's been significant growth of the municipality in recent years, as Jesse just mentioned. And that growth has facilitated the need for additional investments to meet the needs of residents over the longer term, and those changing needs in particular. One thing that's important to note is that there does appear to be strong commitments from council to continue making those investments, which we were able to validate through our early discussions with members of council as part of this engagement. In those discussions, there were some key areas that came out as or were highlighted as very important, and that is including the importance of parks, recs, and arts and culture within the community, the need for exceptional customer service and exceptional communications from the town and the municipality, and the need for the town to receive strong value from the outsourced service providers that they choose to contract with and get service delivery from. So with that, moving towards our project mission and success. So one of the things we like to do when we started an engagement is really understand what we're setting out to do and understand what those key things are that we need to deliver upon to reach a successful outcome. So the project mission for this particular engagement was all about conducting a comprehensive service delivery review that's going to support the town and support council in meeting and exceeding its commitments to establishing a vibrant and healthy community. And so in order to achieve that mission, the defined success factors are fivefold. One would be to develop a really clear understanding of the current state of the town and really understand how things are working today. Second would be identifying opportunities that would make the town more responsive as an organization to advancing council's strategic priorities. There's also the opportunity to align with and across departments that exist within the town today, both from a structural perspective and from a service delivery perspective. And there's an equal opportunity to align with other organizations or other municipalities in terms of structure and service delivery. So learning best practices from others and applying them to the town. And then finally, making sure there's strong buy-in and engagement of the key stakeholders across the town, both from the leadership team perspective and across council. And just finally on the overview, I just wanted to highlight a quick snapshot of our project approach and the methodologies we used throughout the process here. So we followed a 5-step process at a very high level to achieve the final report that you would have seen last week. At the highest level, this began with planning for the engagement, kicking it off with the project team, and then against the backdrop of a detailed current state report, developing a set of key recommendations that look to improve the town's delivery of service going forward. Throughout the engagement, we worked really closely with the town project team through each phase and through each step of this work, which was really helpful in terms of making sure there was clear alignment and understanding between both parties as we worked through. And as you can see at the bottom here, we've used a variety of methodologies within each of these project steps to obtain the necessary inputs and findings that we're looking to achieve. So that includes quite a bit of stakeholder engagement with a variety of different groups, from staff to leadership to council, as well as desk research and market research where and when applicable. So now we'll move into some of the key findings from the current state assessment that was conducted as part of this review. When we look at the town's services, there are a variety of key parties that play a role in delivering service for the town today. First and foremost, in the primary drivers of service delivery, you have the internal staff of the town itself, and they provide services across 4 critical areas: the CAO's office, development and operations, finance, treasury, legal, legislative services, and clerk services. And they also provide a variety of support to the town's committees, and I believe there's 7 of those, and that can be quite involved as well. So I mentioned the internal staff are really the drivers behind service delivery, and with 24 full-time and 22 part-time staff, they wear a variety of hats. They contribute in more ways than one and really do an exceptional job in making sure service gets delivered at a good rate today with the amount of time and bandwidth that they do have available. The next key player in this picture is the third-party providers. So these also play a very important role in the delivery of services for the town. They help with the delivery of critical engineering, planning, and some water and wastewater services. They're significant partners of the town, and the town equally invests a lot into these partners. The support they provide equates to about 7 to 10 full-time employees in terms of support. And the value of these service providers and the third parties used is that they allow the town to draw on a range of expertise and professional qualifications that would frankly not be possible to have in-house with the town all at once. So that flexibility and the ability to draw on that as needed is a real benefit to the town today. The other key players involved in service delivery are the County of Dufferin. They're a key partner in the delivery of service for building, health and safety, and IT as an outsourced partner on that from that perspective. And there's also the boards of management, which continue to oversee fire, indoor recreation, and library services in the town today. So now we have an understanding of how service delivery breaks out. We also thought it would be important to recognize how the staffing complement within the town has changed over the last several years, to really as a means to addressing the significant growth of the town and the demands of residents and constituents across the board. So you'll notice here, looking at the timeline, starting in 2018 with the addition of the dedicated CAO role, there's been quite a bit of either enhanced roles or new roles added to the staffing complement within the town. And you'll notice the intensity of those additions have really ramped up in the last year, in the last fiscal year in specific. And quite a few of those additions actually occurred during our SDR process that we were going on. So we were learning of these additions as we went. But really, this demonstrates just how much room there is to grow in terms of the staffing complement within the town, and should be commended that the town and council has taken this action to enhance capacity. So this is really the key findings from our current state summary, and we've tried to summarize these in a very clear and coherent way and be succinct with it. But we talked to a lot of people through our process, and one thing that was loud and clear was that there were some significant enhancements have been made to the delivery of service in the town over the last several years. And that really speaks to the level of investment we just saw in the staffing complement that's been occurring over time, and so that's really contributed to that enhanced level of service. But outside of that, there were 4 really key themes that emerged from the discussions that we had with stakeholders, from the data and documents that we reviewed from the town. And the first is the increasing resident expectation. So I think Jesse touched on this briefly at the start. But really, there is a different resident expectation today than there was in the past, with population increasing so rapidly in the town in recent years. You have a new mix of demographics in the town. You have new residents coming from different parts of the province or parts of Ontario, and they all bring with them different expectations of services that they'd like to see delivered, different types of availability of those services they'd like to see delivered. And with that, with those changing expectations comes the need to, change how we deliver service to meet those. So that was one of the first key themes we heard through all our discussion and review. The second one was the servicing needs are outpacing the staffing complement. So despite the with the large number of recipients due to the rapid growth of the town, the historical investments in the town staffing complement were not enough to keep pace with that growth. And I think that, while we've seen some additional rigor behind increasing investment in the staffing complement previously, in this past year specifically, historically there was that gap between what was required and what was available in terms of staff capacity. So that was one of the things we heard very loud and clear from many individuals, and is that there definitely needs to be a closing of that gap. The third key theme we heard was the need to align organizational structure with the emerging priorities of the town. So the current structures of the town's operations and development business unit in specific were not well positioned to focus on and address the emerging priorities of the town. And there's some question as well as to the capacity of this group to deliver against those enhanced requirements or different level of service expectations that are being recommended today, or requested today, rather. So there does need to be some consideration around organizational realignment to ensure that the staff and the business unit overall, with respect to development operations, can pivot, adjust, and be able to deliver against those emerging priorities. The fourth key theme is around the expanded use of data to inform decision-making. So the use of data is very limited right now as it stands in the town with respect to service levels or the use of data to drive decisions. And that's been an area that's had limited focus in the last little while for the town. And it's something that definitely should be an area of focus going forward. And that was also something we heard in our consultations with various members of the staff and others we spoke to. But it should be recognized that there is some work going on in that respect in the town. The citywide maintenance manager will have the ability to provide some data that will inform decision-making moving forward. And those kind of initiatives are the type that you'd like to see going forward in a more substantial way to help make sure that all decisions the town makes are informed and grounded in data, in numbers, and in strong rationale. And with that, I will pass it over to Jesse, who's going to walk us through a summary of the recommendations we put forward.
Great. Thanks, Cole. So yes, I'm going to walk through in a bit more detail the recommendations that were included in the report, and you'll see a lot of alignment to the themes that Cole just mentioned, and I'll expand on a few of those as I go through. Cole, if you want to flip to the next slide. Important context with respect to the recommendations. A lot of these do represent improvements to respond to growth pressures across the town, and a need to provide these services to the growing stakeholder base. And the focus here is very much on how to do this in a way, how to grow in a way that is efficient and effective and appropriate for the town. So we do recognize that a lot of these are investments in the town and will require commitments by council. We also recognize that not everything may be possible within current staffing resources, or could they be implemented overnight. And I'll talk more about the sequencing after I go through the recommendations. We'll talk about the prioritization lens that we've applied to the recommendations. But by way of introduction to the recommendations, closing on slide 15, what we've done is we've positioned recommendations within the areas of the town's structure, and I'll walk through the 9 high-level recommendations. Some of these do have sub-recommendations or components associated with them, and I'll cover those as well. And we'll look at recommendations as they apply across the corporation, specific to development and operations, specific to HR, legislative services, and planning. And we'll these together cover that complete org structure for the town, and really are the focus of where we saw opportunities when looking at all of the services across the town. So to start with, on slide 16, the first recommendation is really an overarching recommendation of others that relate to the structure of the town, and this is related to what you just heard Cole speaking to with respect to the way the town is structured. And this also does provide a view of a future structure that's recommended, as well as a good introduction into some of the other relevant recommendations. And what you'll see here is there are recommendations to address elements such as hiring a planning coordinator, clearly distinguishing the parks and recreation services from public works and utilities, the addition of a deputy clerk or committee coordinator, the hiring of a junior municipal bylaw officer, and the hiring of an HR planning coordinator. And we'll cover each of these on the subsequent slides. But what this structure is doing is and what these new additions are doing is it is setting the town up to respond to existing and future growth. One of the things that we observed, and again, Cole mentioned this, is the senior team, frontline staff are very much stretched to capacity. And you'll see that a lot of these new roles both support and enhance direct service delivery and introduce capacity at a senior level to enable that ability to focus on strategic decision making and management. That will allow for more oversight and the ability for longer term planning on new and existing services for the town. So we'll talk through each of these recommendations in more detail as they pertain to the specific recommendations, but did want to introduce the structural considerations to begin with. There's a couple of other corporate-wide considerations on slide 17. While not structural, it is corporate-wide, and we're recommending that the town continues to enhance online service offerings and focus activity on high-value initiatives or activities. So a number of enhancements have been made in recent years, both predating and during COVID, and that momentum should continue. We would recommend that there potentially be some engagement with public to confirm priorities, but at the core, our recommendation would be around further enhancing self-service options. We heard, for example, with respect to billing and bill payments, payment features have been added as online services, but there's potential to enhance features further, such as more complex service request view imbalances, potentially changing information. We would also recommend that the effort to continue to enhance the online facility booking and appointment booking for meetings with town hall staff continue to be enhanced. We understand that right now the process can certainly be initiated online and largely completed online, but there still in some cases are back and forth with residents, as well as some back end work for staff in managing multiple calendars. So an area where there certainly has been good progress, but where there remains opportunities to make the process more efficient. We also are recommending that the town consider stopping civil marriage ceremonies. This is an activity which, after expenses, has minimal contribution to the town's revenue and uses staff time that could be focused on more valuable activities. While not a significantly large amount of time, admittedly, this is time that could be used to support many other initiatives, whether they be in this report or identified elsewhere. We also understand that there are opportunities for residents to acquire these services from local businesses within the town or across the county. On slide 18, one of the, also at a corporate-wide level, one of the focus points for discussions with stakeholders across all services that we were looking at involved what exists by way of data, KPIs, or service standards. And you heard Cole speak a little bit about this. And generally what we found is that outside of provincially mandated standards, for example, water treatment, minimum maintenance standards, things like that, which are in place, there were very few standards or KPIs being tracked. For example, things like monitoring and assessing grass or turf maintenance, examples of cost per activity or volume, tracking and reporting on service standards for inquiries or other activities initiated by residents weren't easily in place or accessible. And that in some cases they may exist through the completion of or assumed completion of activities in the scheduling of work crews, for example. They're not reported on in a ongoing basis, and that does limit the evidence base for senior leaders and councils to make informed decisions regarding the level of service that exists today. So we would strongly recommend that and what this recommendation includes is that the town does develop that clear and comprehensive service levels and standards and a reporting framework that key stakeholders can use to monitor and understand the performance of services across the town. And a positive aspect here is, as Cole mentioned, the town has started to build this foundation. The recent acquisition and implementation of a citywide maintenance manager is supporting the collection of data and will particularly, at least in early days, be supporting the collection of data within the development and operations group. And that will allow the town, or will provide the town with evidence on activity and utilization of assets across the municipality. So much of the work will now be on collecting that information, developing baselines, establishing targets, and it does make sense to, from our perspective, start or focus that within the services provided by Development and Operations Group, which will relate to the next recommendation I'll speak to in a moment. But ultimately, establishing these standards, reporting on them, will allow for that clear answers and clear communications to residents on what can be expected regarding services, be it bylaw, public works, inquiries, other services that are provided. On slide 19, we'll start to move into some of the other groups within the town, and starting with the Development and Operations Group. And really our first recommendation here, and central to recommendations within this group, is to conduct a deep dive examination of the operations and development team. Our review, as we mentioned in the introduction and Denise mentioned, was very much focused on identifying some of the top level priorities for the organization. But it's also clear that there's a number of potential opportunities within this group relating to, as I just mentioned, the collection and use of information to make decisions, but also establishing the right staffing levels and models, so shift schedules, things like that. Understanding the right inventory of assets, equipment, fleet needs, the use of technology, as well as reviewing the internal processes for completing work orders. So those are all opportunities within this group that should be explored. And we do want to be clear that from our perspective, the team here has adapted well to both the town's growth and the immediate needs and shifts in how residents use services provided by this group as a result of COVID. What we're unable to say with confidence, though, is that this is the most efficient or effective way, or that's sustainable long-term. And this recommendation should and would also likely support some of the planned parks and recreation strategies moving forward, and an assumed increase in the use of these services over the longer term. Our view here is that this is a initiative that would require an investment from the town of approximately $80,000. However, as we've pointed out in the review, this should be eligible for grant funding, and an application for grant funding should be able to offset these costs and reduce the amount of investment that the town itself is making. This is an initiative that is very aligned with other grant opportunities that the ministry is making available into the new year. On to slide 20. So also within the Development and Operations group, our next recommendation has to do with the structure of this group. And this is pending or subject to the review that I just discussed. We do think there's a strong case here for a more clear and formal separation between public works, sort of the traditional roads, utilities, et cetera, with parks and recreation and potentially culture. The exact model would be part of what we believe would be refined through that Development and Operations review, but we do think that there's a case to be made that both would remain within the same or under the same reporting relationship as the director as it is today, but there would be dedicated management level leadership allocated to both of these groups. And again, this is a case where some of this change has already begun to be implemented with some recent organizational structure changes within this group, where there is that leadership now, but that we also believe that there should be a dedicated dedicated staff resources allocated to this function. The functions and activities performed by Parks and Recreation and Public Works are sufficiently different from one another to justify this. that said, we don't believe that these groups should operate in silos, and that there will of course be communication between the two where it makes sense. But the focus is that there should be a dedicated focus on each, and we're also would look to the review of the development operations group to again provide some insights on the overall level of resources across both of those functions. And because of that, the act of separating these functions by itself should not have a significant financial cost associated with it, and doing so would put the town in better alignment with some common practices in other municipalities, and in our view, set the town up for future growth in the area. Moving on to HR. Here we're recommending the addition of an HR coordinator to the town's staffing complement. So what we heard is that many of the day-to-day HR tasks and updating policies, conducting research on new policies are conducted by staff members for whom that is not their core role and detracts from core responsibilities. We've also heard, as an example, senior members of CAO as an example being pulled into activities that we wouldn't necessarily expect a CAO to be involved in, and detracting from their ability to provide a senior level of leadership for the organization. And given the potential for additional services being added to the town, we do feel that there is a need for, even today, we feel that there's a need for an HR coordinator role. Furthermore, the role would allow the town to deliver on a number of HR initiatives, which I'll talk about in a moment, as well as provide capacity to ensure, again, compliance with mandatory HR requirements, compliance with existing policies, updating elements based on changing guidelines in a way that doesn't detract from significant leadership focus. This would require an investment by the town to fund this role, and of course there would be staff time to recruit and onboard an HR coordinator role. This ties very much into the next recommendation related to HR services, which is when we were looking at and discussing activities within the town, it was clear that there's a number of opportunities that broadly fall under the HR domain. And it's important to note here that the current firm the town uses for HR advice provides strategic level advice on critical issues, critical questions. They are not and should not be viewed as a substitute HR department. That's, in our view, not an effective or efficient use of their skills. And as a result, the town does not have current strategies for a number of areas related to, or recent strategies related to areas such as employee engagement, retention, succession planning, professional development. There's also limited capacity to focus on things like performance appraisal. So these are all important functions of a municipality, and typically fall into the domain of an HR team to lead. These are some core initiatives that we would recommend the proposed HR coordinator work to establish and then continue to own moving forward. Without the addition of the HR coordinator that I spoke to, it's very unlikely that these activities would be complete. We're not confident there would be the capacity in the team, availability to complete those activities. So the addition of the HR coordinator, as outlined on the previous slide, does represent an investment for the town, but this begins to outline the activities and the benefits that investment would pay off with respect to the services provided internally to town staff. Slide 23, moving into the area of legislative services and the clerk. We've developed here a pair of recommendations that really address two capacity limitations that we also observed with respect to service delivery. So the first is around bylaw. There's currently a single full-time bylaw enforcement officer, and this has been, from everything we've heard, a great development for the town and service that was identified to us as being very important. However, there is currently no coverage when the primary bylaw officer is unavailable, whether it's a day off, a vacation, a sick day. And this limits the town's approach to bylaw enforcement activities. And we heard, again, that this is, through our conversations, that this is an area of commitment to continue and enhance the service being provided, and adding this resource along with developing that better understanding of service standards and reporting, which I spoke on earlier, will assist in the service capacity and the service quality related to bylaw enforcement. Also within this group, we've made the recommendation to add a deputy clerk or committee coordinator role to address some clear capacity constraints on the part of the clerk. There's a significant workload. Currently, the number of roles in a workload that in our view is not necessarily sustainable, supporting planning administration, some performance appraisal, responsible for the IT contracting with the county, legislative services, including bylaw, customer service, others report up into the clerk. And this is a considerable, and there's also the considerable workload for the 7 committees, which Cole mentioned earlier. Well, not all of that falls on just the clerk. Some of these do have significant budgets, as Cole mentioned, and that's on top or in addition to other legislative requirements as well. So as the town has grown, there has not, as far as we were able to see, a lot of excess capacity or extra capacity added in this area. So both of these roles would have costs associated with them, totaling around $170,000 between the two. And these would be new costs, but as Denise has mentioned, some of this has been or is being considered in draft budgets moving forward, and really does represent an opportunity to enhance services provided and address capacity constraints among staff, which is an important consideration in our perspective for council. Finally, on planning, which is the last area of recommendations, and then I'll get into some of the implementation considerations and then pause for questions. But when we're looking at planning, we do think there's an opportunity here to realign the planning coordinator role that the town currently has. So currently, there's a planning coordinator role that's located within one of your third-party providers, your planning services. They've been acting as a frontline planning coordinator. This is a staff member of your third-party provider. We recommend that this role is no longer performed by the third party, but is rather brought in-house with the same roles and responsibilities that that function currently has, but as an internal resource. And that individual would report to the director of legislative services and the clerk. Bringing this in-house would enhance the availability of this role in interacting with stakeholders, including developers, would remove some of the significant challenges that we've heard about, just with respect to limitations around the third-party provider not being able to be on site to deliver the service, and would also enhance the internal development and knowledge within the planning function, just generally within the town, and has the potential to add potential flexibility to add more responsibilities as the role stabilizes. We'd emphasize that the role would continue to work very closely with the senior resources of your third-party provider today, and this is and that is something that we strongly recommend would continue, as well as, of course, the reporting relationship to the clerk internally. And again, there would be costs for this role. However, our understanding is that the cost would be recoverable from planning fees. So this is a addition that would have ultimately a net zero impact on the budget. So that gets us into a bit about implementation. And we recognize that not everything can be done immediately. So we have to look at implementation considerations. And really our view of implementation here is such that we need to be structured in a way that allows us to move forward where we are considering the benefits of each recommendations against costs, be those financial, staff, IT, other resources. Generally, that will mean that not everything can happen at once, and that items become multi-year initiatives. On slide 27, this framework brings together our way of assessing costs with benefits. So looking at, in terms of the kind of the ease or difficulty to actually implementing a recommendation, the timeline, the time, the length of time required to see an implementation or to see a recommendation through, as well as the costs associated with that recommendation. And then, of course, around the expected benefit, looking at impacts to staff efficiencies, improving the resident and recipient experience or service level. Of course, that was a very high focus here, and as well looking at the ability to potentially find cost savings, or more specifically for the town, looking at the efficiency of recommendations and the ability to impact efficient operations. So on the recommendations, what you see is on slide 28. We have a number of recommendations grouped on the top half of the quadrants, which is great. Those are the recommendations that have a higher benefit or expected benefit, and a high number of priority recommendations in that upper right quadrant, which is not uncommon distribution when new roles are being added or considered. We often find that they end up in that quadrant, and then towards the moving on still on the top half, moving towards the left, we have the development and operations, as well as the other corporate-wide initiatives, which are a little bit more strategic, a little bit more addressing some of the structural changes to the organization, specifically development and operations group, thinking about how there's changes across the organization with respect to the collection and use of information and data. This gets us to a timeline, and really our recommendation here is that we continue to, the town continues to move forward with the implementation of these recommendations, and begins with the review of development and operations. We again have positioned that there because we believe that there's an opportunity to have grant funding applied to that review, of course, subject to that being a successful application. And then moving forward with some of the additional roles that we've outlined there, HR coordinator, the deputy clerk roles, as the first two, junior bylaw enforcement officer and the planning coordinator. Shortly thereafter, again, just sequencing the implementation of those roles, recognizing current staff capacity. And then some of the more strategic recommendations, development of service level standards. Certainly we think that there will be findings that come out of the development and operational review that could inform that. So our recommendation there would be to, or will inform that. So our recommendation there would be that that really continues into late next year and into the following year. Enhancing the various HR related initiatives, that's currently viewed as a lower priority because it really, without the addition of that HR coordinator role, it is not something that is realistic. But assuming if that role were to be hired, the HR coordinator role, those recommendations related to HR initiatives would become central and very will become central to the role and the function of that HR coordinator. So that would move up into a higher priority with the addition of that role. And then just a final few notes in terms of our review, and then I'll pause for comments or questions. We obviously do recommend that the municipality takes the full report away, and that it's used as a guide moving forward. And I just reiterate again that in moving forward, it's critical for us to emphasize that a lot of what's proposed won't be possible with just the existing resources. There are investments required and needed to continue providing the services that the town would like to provide. And again, the general context of this review is that the town is growing, and we've presented a path forward to continue that growth in a prioritized and efficient way. The focus here wasn't to find that silver bullet of cost reductions. It was to really ensure that there's a sustainable and efficient growth plan for the future, and that's really what this report does contain. And then finally, I would just take a moment to thank Denise and the team for the support in this review. As Denise mentioned, there's a considerable amount of work that did go into the report and a considerable amount of participation and review from the members of the CN team, as well as members of staff from across the organization who participated in a couple of focus groups. So certainly had a good participation from across the organization, and I would just want to extend our thank you to the team. But with that, I'll stop there and can certainly take any comments or questions through the chair, I guess.
Thanks, Jesse. Yeah, can we just take off the share screen? Yeah, perfect. Thank you. All right, well, it's certainly a lot to consider, but are there any initial questions for Jesse or Cole? Councilor Bernardo?
You always know I'm going to have a question. In regards to enhancing the services, online services there, I don't see a recommendation from switching more IT personnel in there because I know the county is delivering our IT currently, but I don't believe that the IT services they deliver currently would include anything in the way of enhancing online services. We don't have someone, for example, who would be able to do apps or provide the sort of online services the same way as the town of Orangeville does. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so through the chair, so certainly it's something to, I think, consider. So I would say that, yeah, I think that your assessment of the services from an IT perspective currently provided by the county align to our understanding. With respect to the enhancement of services into the future, I think that any service that or any activity that you did want to implement online would need to be assessed for the skills that you have in-house and determine whether it could be done in-house or not. I do understand that there has been some development of at least some applications done in-house, but for substantial projects, that may require the support of outside vendors to assist. I'm not sure that at this point, we didn't necessarily hear that there's I'll say a volume of work there to justify a full in-house position to build these types of services. But I certainly think that it would be a potential for there would be a potential for the town to leverage outside expertise to develop some of those online service offerings kind of as they're identified.
I'm always concerned when we go to outside vendors. I think the cost sometimes is higher when we go to outside vendors than when we do in-house services and third parties. And again, looking at your report on third parties.
Sorry, Councilor Bernardo, just before we move off the IT thing, I think Denise maybe has a comment there too, just before we kind of switch gears.
Thank you, Mayor Mills. I just wanted to indicate that the Optimus Group had identified that IT, we are looking at some increases from the county, but those are being reviewed currently in the context of the county's SDR and some of the critical directions that they are adopting. We're certainly aware that we can expand some of the, I guess, applications from IT. We have developed some of our own apps. While they're modest, we did do a walking app during the pandemic. We've looked at some other applications through our GIS coordinator of data, but certainly we can work with the county in terms of scope of service. I think the Optimus review has indicated, similar to our other third-party partners, that when we have only one person providing that service and not a multidisciplinary team that comes with those firms, or in this particular instance, with the county's infrastructure, not only the persons, but the hardware that comes with that in terms of the technology and the software and the other skills that we receive. We'll be evaluating all of that in the context of the costs that they're going to be looking at for 2022 and bringing that back to council at the first budget meeting in December.
And that would be similar to looking at all our third-party providers. We'll be looking at that during the budgetary time.
Based on the recommendations that are before you in this, no, we haven't adjusted the approach that we would take with the other third-party providers, namely SVA, GSP, or Aqua. Aqua's on a 10-year contract, and there's been nothing that we've seen through this analysis that would provide evidence that those particular relationships are not continuing to be beneficial to us, not only financially, but strategically.
I'll wait for budget time then. Okay, thank you.
All right. Anybody else? No? And any questions or comments from staff? No? Okay. Well, thank you, gentlemen. A couple of things that sort of stand out for me, just big picture. You know, one is how far we have come in a relatively short period of time, but secondarily, how much further we have to go to really take this to the next level. And you know, that's obviously, you know, why we enlisted your help, and I thank you for that. So I guess the next move is for staff to come back with some thoughts on implementation, and much of that, I guess, will start to take shape during budget deliberations this year, which start next week. Denise?
Yes, Mayor Mills, I should note, because Jesse referenced it, is with the operations review recommendation, we did have the opportunity, because the third intake of the modernization fund was open at that time, to make an application for about $80,000, and that application has been submitted. We're obviously hoping we're successful. We should know early in the new year.
Good. Okay, last call for questions. All right, can I get a motion then to receive the information presented by Optimus SBR for information? Councillor Hall, second by Councillor Fegan. All in favor? It's carried. All right. Thanks again, guys.
Our pleasure. Thank you very much.
Yeah, have a good evening. Okay, next up is council inquiries. Are there any inquiries tonight? Deputy Mayor Anderson and then Councillor Bernardo.
Thanks, Mayor Mills. This is for staff, maybe in particular Steve. I don't remember how far back I asked a question about getting us information as to what the cost would be working maybe in tandem with the development, Fieldgate development, with respect to the sidewalk and extending the sidewalk from where the development is, I guess, going to end, I guess, from 89 to 124. We know, you know the interest I'm talking about, Stephen, and extending that to the traffic lights. And so I was hoping that we maybe get an update as to where we are regarding that, or maybe when we can expect to hear something back on that.
It's a good question. We've been working with the town's engineers as well as Fieldgate engineers on the design of the county road improvements. That's gone through a few rounds of revision, but has reached its final form. So now that we understand that and the cost that they've provided to secure that work, we can apply a similar assumption to the remaining distance going up the other side of the county road, or even provide maybe an option of both sides and summarize costs. So I think I could probably do that for the next meeting in December, have a high level engineering cost on that.
Perfect, thank you.
Okay, no problem.
Councillor Bernardo.
My question was more for staff, I guess. Leaves on the road, when are we going to finish cleaning up? Because there are a lot of roads that still have quite a few leaves, and people have put them right to the side of the road, not even on the boulevard necessarily. And with snow starting to fly, I'm just thinking if they're frozen and our plow hits them, it's going to be quite an interesting time.
Through your worship, our staff have been working on that. They broke it down this year into a number of different phases through town and circulated those notices out. They are still trying to catch up with the last of the leaves there to get everything straightened up before everything freezes. We want to make sure that we don't have leaves floating around, plugging off catch basins and that sort of situation, because that add to flooding down the road potentially with any melt. So yeah, staff is working on that currently again. And yeah, we want to get them all cleaned up before we get into a good freeze here. So
I just noticed in our area up here that there is quite a few catch basins full of leaves, and there are quite a bit of leaves on the side of the road. So I don't know when they're getting up into this area, but like I said, with the weather, the way it seems to be going, it's not good right now. But yeah, and again, getting back, I guess, to what I mentioned at the last meeting, I noticed again with the freeze up ice build up on some of the sidewalks is considerable. There's some pretty low areas full of water. Is it possible to create a drainage off onto the boulevard so we could drain some of those lower areas? I'm thinking of the one especially at Greenwood north of Canfield. There's quite a bit of a puddle of water there. And with the freeze up and ice in the morning and people trying to walk, I noticed there were people that swear it looked like they took a bit of a slide there across it. So is it possible while the ground is still soft to create a bit of a drain off?
yeah, through your worship, staff was out and looked at those areas. Those areas seem to be compounded by an issue from homeowners with either downspouts or sump pump discharges to the exterior. So we'll have to go back and look at that again and see if they could be trenched off a little bit or some kind of water course put over the boulevard out towards the curb line just to free it up. But yeah, it's something we're going to have to keep an eye on there too, because it's not localized just to that one area. We do have some places where people just don't realize that they're causing a hazard discharging to the front of the property if it's not designed to do that. So
yeah, I'm just worried that we don't end up with a lawsuit with somebody breaking their neck or leg or something of that nature there. That's my concern.
Okay, any other inquiries? Deputy Mayor, back to you.
Thank you. This will be really quick. This is going back to Steve on the Fieldgate development. So my understanding is that Mara is no longer with Fieldgate, and she would typically provide us with updates with respect to the types of businesses that are showing interest, etc. So number one is, do you have any updates with respect to, at the time, I know that she was speaking about Canadian Tire being interested, etc., whether that's still a possibility. And then secondly, if you're not aware of the updates, is there somebody else that's going to be stepping in for Mara to come and provide us with updates and answer any questions that we have?
I could certainly inquire with Fieldgate on that. Their commercial representatives, Mara was more on the residential side, but commercial representatives are in touch with us often. And they do have their site plan approval for the west commercial block, the larger one, and it's fully tenanted. So they've pulled building permits now for all the buildings, including the food land, the Dollarama, the LCBO. There's the 5-unit building in the southwest corner, which has I think it was 4 restaurants and a medicinal cannabis operation, and then the McDonald's building. So everything is, we know who the tenants are for all those buildings that they pulled permits for. They haven't made any application for the east commercial block yet. So they have space there. I don't think it would be large enough in all likelihood for something like a Canadian Tire, but they have space there for additional tenants when the time comes that they have a building to move forward with.
Thanks, Steve. And you just said something that triggered a thought, and this will be my last question. Recently in Toronto, I believe, there was a motion brought by, I think, a councillor with respect to the distribution or the proximity, I think is probably better, of these cannabis stores in close proximity. I was just wondering if you, because I think now in our town, we have about 4, probably within a stone's throw away of each other. Do you have any comments on that or thoughts? I don't want to put you on the spot.
We have had
Unnecessarily.
some inquiries about that through you, Mr. Chair, and the way the provincial regulations have been set up is that if you permit a retail store, you have to permit in the same zone this type of retailing. You can't require separation amongst the same type of retail store, even if it's cannabis. But the one unique aspect of the licensing requirement for these is that they do have to be on a site that's a certain distance from schools and childcare centers. But beyond that, if they're in a zone that permits retailing, then we don't have any ability to require separation between them or limit the number of them. A lot of communities are seeing quite a number of them coming up, and not sure if the demand is there to support that many operations, but time will tell.
I guess the thought is, Steve, that the market will eventually sort of sort it out. But yeah, I mean, to your point, Deputy Mayor, it does seem a little funny with a small community to have that many, but we're certainly not alone. I recently drove through the hamlet of Thornton. Anybody who's aware of Thornton, I mean, it's quite small, and it appears that there's 2 cannabis stores in Thornton, which is essentially just one intersection. So we're not alone, but I guess in the fullness of time, as I said, maybe the market will sort things out, and those that are well run and appropriately priced and everything else will succeed, and maybe the others won't. But time will tell. Denise.
Thank you, Mayor Mills. I just wanted to follow up with Steve's comment to the Deputy Mayor. I actually spoke with Mike McLean last week with Fieldgate, and we discussed, among other issues, that many people like to presume what's going into the buildings. For example, Costco, Canadian Tire, what was the other one? Swiss Chalet. So to stop, I guess, the guessing, even though there's a big sign that says it's going to be Foodland, they're going to prepare something and update the public as well as council on what actual businesses are going when and where, so that the timelines are known and that people that are speculating can just have an awareness of what actually is going to be coming to our community.
I mean, we're not getting a Swiss Chalet. I'm so disappointed.
Maybe it's a Dairy Queen.
Any other inquiries before we move on? Okay. All right, so the first report under the regular agenda is a report from Steve Weaver, and this is with respect to our Fiddle Park plan. So Steve's going to present some of the findings from our survey as well as some initial thoughts on what's possible out there.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. And I've just shared a brief summary presentation on screen here to highlight some of the information in my report. So we have completed much of the background work and consultation in support of the Fiddle Park plan component of the overall 2021-2022 master plan for the Parks and Recreation townwide. And really the main reason for the report at this point is a touch point with council on some of the key input that we received, but also to get your feedback on kind of what we would call the groundwork or the foundation of where we think the direction should be heading on this. Obviously, if you take a piece of land the size of Fiddle Park and you keep all options on the table, there could be quite a broad range of concepts which may take the consultation, may make the consultation not as focused as it could be. So to try and bring a little bit more focus and emphasis on key directions emerging from the work so far, this looks for some comment and feedback from council on a draft vision and some preliminary guiding principles. Sorry, skipped ahead a bit too far there. So the location, but just for context, again, the park is a very large property. There's about 31 acres of quote unquote usable land in the center of the property, which is currently predominantly used for festival type use or event type use with serviced campsites. There is a community garden, a building, and a pavilion as well. And then the larger land area to the south is natural environment, which is protected both through the town's official plan and zoning bylaw, as well as the Nottawasaga Valley Conservation Authority. Not really extensive recreational use opportunity in that south part. There is a little bit more of that type of compatible environmental opportunity in the north part, certainly with trails and that kind of thing in the woodlot, which is about 14.5 acres to the north. Just zeroing in a little bit on the central part of the park. This is the existing conditions. So the community garden was most recently added in the north part of the central area. And the rest of the park area is predominantly, as I say, special event and camping sites. The town does store snow along the easterly boundary of the site in the wintertime. There are 2 buildings or structures. So there's the original Fiddle Park building with the washrooms and community room, et cetera, and concession. And then there's the more recent covered event structure, pavilion, pole barn to the east of that. And then you can see the internal driveways as well. And there are some trails both to the north and south along the county road and through the wooded area to the Sylvanwood area to the east. A little bit of brief recap of the history. So this property came to be Fiddle Park in 2006. And at the time, the Fiddle Park Management Plan was created. The management plan really established Fiddle Park as a predominantly an event venue for Fiddlefest predominantly, and other events, of course, have been added over the years. The management model put forward at that time, and that existed for a number of years, was to have the park management run by a board or committee. So the Fiddle Park Committee did organize events and program the park for events for the first number of years. Following that, in 2009, the overall townwide parks master plan, the first one for the town, was completed. And one of the key inputs we received through that process, or one of the key themes identified, was a recommendation to actually undertake a more detailed site master plan for Fiddle Park and try to encourage more townwide use. The sentiment from the community, even at that time, was that it was underutilized and that there should be more community recreational opportunity provided in the park. Of course, you're familiar with the 2019 Community Improvement Plan and some of the ideas that came forward from that process, such as having some outdoor skating areas, community gardens, which have been added, pavilion, which was provided or added in 2017, additional parking, trails, etc. So now we're looking at this not only through the lens of considering additional community use opportunity, but in the context of the overall townwide parks and recreational needs. On to the community survey. So I'll just highlight a few things. I won't go through all the summary that's provided in my report. We got great participation from the community. So, kudos to all those who took the time to complete the survey. There were 481 surveys completed. The survey ran from mid-September to mid-October, so about a month. Majority of the survey respondents are from town, so Shelburne residents, and then we did get some visitors to town as well who took the survey, 17%. And 95% of the people who took the survey have visited the park, obviously then leaving 5% who have not been to the park. This was interesting, but probably unsurprising that the visits to Fiddle Park overwhelmingly were event-based. So people who have visited the park or members of their household have visited the park. It's only 1 or 2 times a year for the most part. A number of people do go daily, but that's a limited number. And then there are more people who visit the park weekly or kind of monthly or every couple of weeks. And the types of uses that we're seeing correlated with those results are walking and dog walking and picnicking and that kind of thing. So these were the top activities reported by people who visited the park: events, walking and dog walking. Community garden use is shown already as a popular activity. And then a number of other activities were reported by respondents as well. Going to the desired program elements, so things that people would like to be able to do or have facilities for in the park. The top one was to have some trails, additional trails added. But then winter activities as well was very popular. So the idea of skating pathways was a common response, the second highest. And then playgrounds, so having some kids playground areas in the park, followed by naturalized area, and kind of rounding out the top 5, a dog park was also identified as something that respondents would like to see. So not really surprising necessarily, but you can get some idea of the community priorities from these results. The desired types of facilities, people would really like to, they felt that the use of the park would be better supported with some open public washrooms. That really is a critical element. So for community multi-use parks, one thing that we'll look further into is whether the existing building, which does have washrooms, if the building could be modified so that access to those washrooms could be provided without providing access to the whole building. To kind of secure that and leave it more flexible for community use. There were other hits like lighting, shade structures, dog facilities, etc., really supporting the program elements that people desire to see in the park. So that's just a brief synopsis of some of the key survey highlights. There's more detail and analysis of that in our report. We'll be looking further at that as well as we move forward with some concept development. But for now, we have extracted the general theme or vision, which is summarized here. So Fiddle Park will be reimagined to benefit the entire community, creating spaces where people can connect with one another, share experiences, and enjoy the natural environment of the park. So this is really a broad, overarching statement about the kind of the theme and direction for Fiddle Park. And then to supplement that and give it a little bit more detail, we've outlined 5 preliminary guiding principles for council consideration. So again, this is based on the community input and discussions with staff. So designing the park more of a focus for community level use. So over time, what that would really mean is phasing out the camping use in favor of having more multi-use facility and program areas in the park. But having flexibility in the design of those spaces so that the space still can be used for community events, but also provides for more regular use on a daily or weekly basis. That the natural setting of the park would be maintained as much as possible, providing strong connections to the surrounding natural environments, so the adjoining wooded areas and so forth, whether that's trails or just maintaining natural linkages. Another key area for improvement is expanding 4-season use, in particular winter use. So things like skating pathways and trails, rinks, tobogganing. There's a whole host of winter activities that have been identified by participants as potential options for Fiddle Park. And then finally, providing for universal accessibility. So that would be wherever possible, obviously within the more developed part of the park, achieving AODA standards. That is not always possible in the context of things like nature trails, where the priority has to be given to protecting the existing topography and not modifying the natural environment too much. So those are kind of the 5 key guiding principles. In relation to phasing out of camping facilities, we did look at where there are other campgrounds in the vicinity of Shelburne, just as a comparison. It's recognized that Fiddle Park doesn't directly compete with other campgrounds because it's more of an event-based camping experience. But there are 5 of them within, about 30 kilometers, so a relatively short drive for a variety of camping experiences, whether it's trailering or camping in tents, etc. So we've identified the locations of those 5 other options for camping in the area. Finally, I will note that there were a number of survey respondents who did like the fact that there is a trailer dump out or clean out in the park that's free for use. That's something that we want to discuss further with council as we go forward with a recommended plan, whether that's something that the town would want to maintain, or if that should be a fee for service type of facility, recognizing that really only benefits folks who have an RV or trailer in the community. And typically, if you're going to use that kind of service elsewhere, you would have to pay to use it, either by booking a site at the campground or otherwise. So I think that briefly covers the main points from my report. And so I'll stop sharing my screen and can come back to the presentation if needed, but would be happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. Thoughts or questions? Councillor Bernardo?
Yes, I know at the end there you provided other camping sites around, but the original intent of camping in that was for the Heritage Fiddle Contest, whatever you want to call it. And whenever that redevelops, and if it ever develops back up again, where camping was the reason people came to the community, that was the original intent in the history of that park to begin with. And it also was combined with service clubs at one point during that history period. When you reached out and you were doing your survey, did you reach out to any of the service clubs to get any of their thoughts?
So that is one of our key next steps, and I may have skipped past that slide. Oh, don't know where it went. Is that we're going to have more focused consultation through interviews and focus groups with a number of service provider or stakeholders, including the service clubs. And so we can hone in on some of that input as well.
Just on that point, Councillor Bernardo, you'll probably remember as part of our strategic plan, one of the things we had talked about was a Parks and Rec task force, which was made up primarily of members from the various service clubs. And my thought, in suggesting that initially was that would be part of the visioning exercise for Fiddle Park going forward. And I've talked with staff a couple of times about that, and I think actually Jennifer's gone so far as to send out an invite to the service clubs already. And the plan is, I think that I'll be sitting down with representatives from each of those clubs early in December, I think.
That's right.
Forget the date offhand, but I agree. I think that's a critical stakeholder group that we have to consult with. And get their commitment and buy-in on this stuff too.
Yeah, because of the other question is the infrastructure that's currently in there was set up for camping. Are we looking at removing some of that infrastructure if we were to go in a different direction?
So the details of what that would look like and the timing of it would be something to come, but the basic direction that we're putting forward as a draft guiding principle for discussion is that you would move more towards regular, community park use and not have areas dedicated to, say, one specific event or camping, accommodating camping. So that will go out to the groups for feedback, and we'll get more, reaction to that kind of direction. But that's kind of the guiding principle that we're putting forward in draft at this point.
Yeah, I understand that. That wasn't my question. My question was I guess the thoughts are that if we do move forward with a more usage for other than camping, the infrastructure that's currently in there would have to be removed because it is set up for camping. That was my question.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
So I think Denise had a comment to add to that.
No, I just wanted to provide the context that in addition, the direction staff understood from council when the consideration for the sale of Fiddle Park was not supported was that you wanted to see the park evolve into something that the community would embrace and use. And what that meant is that the open spaces that are there would be multi-purpose. They would provide support for a multitude of different uses, including continued events. And I think that's why we showed where camping could be provided as an alternative location, but you would still come to the park to enjoy a weekend event. And additionally, that chart that we showed through the survey comments, I think reinforces what we thought, and it's now evidence that a lot of people that said they didn't even use Fiddle Park are showing that they don't use Fiddle Park. And some of them don't use it because maybe it doesn't correspond to what they want. And while the events are fantastic and they're great, there may be more traditional park elements that would bring the community there on a daily basis, for example. So that was sort of the direction we took, that you wanted to see this park celebrated, used, and that I guess we would hope that every member of our community would recognize it where it is and be there more than once a year potentially. So that was sort of the foundation under which we move forward with, and not to continue to have an open space as lovely as it is that might not be as utilized as it could be.
Thank you, Mary Anderson.
Yeah, and let me just follow up on what Denise said. First of all, it's tremendous work by staff, everybody involved with coming up with this detailed report. It's exactly what we asked for as a council, and it's exactly what the community has asked for. I can't tell you how many times, and I know I'm not unique in this situation, of how many people have approached and said, you know, when are the amenities coming? You know, our taxes are either going up and I really don't see the amenities that are necessary for a growing community. And this provides that, in my view, in spades. So commercial certainly was one aspect of it, other than residential. People wanted commercial. And the survey, the people spoke loud and clear, in my view, as to the kind of services that should be there at that park. So I'm excited. Of course, we have to consult the groups, but I think we have to have a new vision to modernize and provide, as Denise said, more amenities that are ones that the community is asking for. And again, if we needed any evidence of that, I think the response to the survey has established that. So those are my comments. Thank you.
I think that's a very good point. And I mean, Denise had referenced the whole discussion surrounding the potential sale of Fiddle Park, which, you know, three of us will remember quite well. It's about 4 years ago. I mean, it certainly wasn't a comfortable exercise to go through. But you know, one of the things that I think was distilled most clearly from that whole process was that everybody who spoke out in support of keeping Fiddle Park seemed to recognize the fact that it was being underutilized. The asset wasn't being maximized under its current use. And I think there was a level of commitment offered by everybody, again, who was, you know, speaking out as a proponent for keeping it, that we need to start to move towards something that allows that park to be used on a more regular basis. And the fact that we're seeing that, you know, the vast majority of respondents in a survey that was well responded to, I'll add, still is only attending the park 1 or 2 times a year. You know, and that's certainly contrary to, I think, what everybody came away from that potential sale hoping for. So I think this sets us on the right track. And you know, certainly there's going to be more discussion going forward. But I think everybody has to come to the table, you know, looking at this reasonably to say, okay, fine, you know, despite past uses, you know, going forward, what is really going to maximize this asset for the whole community. And to that end, Steve, I really did like kind of that vision statement that you included towards the end, that, you know, the overall vision is that this park should be something that can be widely used by the whole community. Denise?
Thank you, Mayor Mills. I just wanted to also stress the input from the community with the 4-season use, with a huge emphasis on winter. And COVID has actually reinforced how critical outdoor recreation that is free for the most part and accessible is to the community for their personal wellness and their community's health or their family's health. So we'll be aligning this recommendation or these vision and these guidelines as well within the budget framework and within the draft 2022 budget for your consideration to help us move forward with some of the, I guess, amenities that could be provided on quick wins, especially within a park setting, whether it's at Fiddle Park or another park. But we believe that the transition to winter has bearing on what the community can expect. And even if it's not something they've been Canadianized with yet, let's say, it's something that provides a gathering place for many, and it's really critical to their social and health as well. So we believe that we can do this, but it also means the investment on the operations side and why the ops review is critical and how all of these are aligning. And next will be the Grace Tippling Hall in terms of where you'd like to take us as a community for Parks and Rec, and particularly outdoor rec, and how we can improve our parks in particular and our trails. So this is sort of that foundation to that evolution, but it's a critical next step.
Councillor Wagner.
Yes, thank you very much, Mayor Mills. Just kind of briefly, I just wanted to sort of mention that I agree with what's been said. It's really important that we pay attention to what the community wants. I'd like to just sort of say maybe, you know, my vision personally is similar to a jacuzzi park. You know, that's a very central hub in Brampton, and it's very multi-use, from playgrounds to skating to swimming in the summer. I mean, they even have animals, which is super cool. I mean, not saying we need that, but I'm just saying, right? You know, there's the community gardens that we have. Well, they have also the gardens there. They decorate it and they make sure that it's lit for Christmas and things like that. So when you're walking through, it's enjoyable. So I just think that, you know, replicating something similar to that would be very beneficial in the community. You know, they even have sports too, right? So there's still a section within Chinguacousy Park for sports activities. So it's so multifunctional. And I really think that, you know, we can repeat that sort of aspect here as well, and still use it for events and whatnot. So I guess my only question is today we're sort of approving this in principle. So because, you know, we've seen plans in, you know, 2006, 2009, now again in 2021. I just really want to make sure that, you know, we've got our foot on the gas pedal, you know, and we're moving forward, because it seems like we keep seeing these reports or we keep having these ideas and these discussions, and yet we're still in the same place as we were when I moved here, you know, 18 years ago. So, I'm hoping that, you know, this will start to propel us forward. I know that we still need to contact, you know, the service groups and get their input, obviously, of course. But I'm hoping that, you know, when that invitation is put out to the service groups, that there's a real strong emphasis on getting this done ASAP. You know, we've seen some hesitation, obviously, with creating sort of that community task force or committee that, you know, Mayor Mills was trying to get together. And, you know, when we don't have people engaged, it just continues to sort of fall by the wayside. So I hope that, you know, the invite will have sort of a sense of urgency that, you know, we really want to make sure that this moves forward, and we need your help to do that. So we need you to step up and attend a meeting and come out and voice your opinions. And that way we can really move forward on this, and we can work on adapting it, you know, wholeheartedly instead of just in principle. So yeah, thank you so much for all your hard work. And I really look forward to seeing this, you know, happen sooner rather than later. And yeah, I appreciate everything you guys have done.
Deputy Mayor.
Yeah, just very quickly, and I think Councilor Wagner made some excellent points about getting it going, because I agree. I don't think I want to be careful on how I say this, but I don't want to be held hostage with respect to progress and moving forward. Like I said, the survey has spoken, and we should be moving very quickly on this, regardless of whether a few groups may or may not want, or a few groups may or may not agree with the vision. The reason why we did the survey was to try to get the majority of the population to be engaged and to comment, and they've done that. So hopefully, as Councilor Wagner pointed out, it's not going to stymie the process. But to Denise, we talked about, or you mentioned rather, some quick wins. I guess with items that we're able to prioritize, how soon do you think, assuming that we're able to get to this relatively quickly, when we can start seeing some of these quick wins potentially?
Through the mayor to the deputy mayor, we'll address that within the budget and the budget framework. Obviously, a lot of the opportunities that the visioning statement or the survey have identified come with some costs. Not all are as significant as others. We do have some significant constraints in that park in terms of grading and scope and slope of areas, even to accommodate. I mean, just recently we looked diligently and exhausted every opportunity to see if we could put an additional skating rink there. It's just not possible with some of the topographical challenges that we're experiencing. So we're currently reviewing whether we could actually flood the walking path at the Highlands / Natasha Peterson Park as a solution for something more to the community. A tobogganing hill is something that we think is a pretty quick win in the future, but we'll go through all of that. I think we've given you a heads up that we are going to be facing a very significant, challenging financial year in 2022. You'll hear more about that on the 29th of November, and you'll have to give us direction on what kind of investments you'd like to see immediately in 2022 in Parks and Rec.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, anybody else? So just to be clear, what staff is asking for essentially this evening is just support in principle for the vision and the guiding principles that Steve laid out there, so that further development and consultation can happen. And then ultimately what we'll see return to us is a draft concept plan that we can weigh in on again. So with that, could I get a mover and seconder for that motion to receive the report and to accept those principles? Moved by Councillor Fegan, seconded by Councillor Wagner. Any further discussion on that? All in favor? Carried. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you.
Okay, so the next report is with respect to the Grace Tippling Hall revitalization. And we were joined by Emmett Ferguson. Emmett, welcome.
Thank you, Your Worship, and honored councillors. Joining you tonight from not less than sunny Kimberley, Ontario, here in Grey County. And thanks all for your patience with the evening and indeed with my forthcoming presentation, which I will go to now. Seeing that that's in presenter view, I will rather play from here. And all right. So tonight's presentation is entitled Grace Tippling Hall as a Civic Enterprise Opportunity. Just quickly for our agenda this evening, we're going to begin looking at the scoping survey and workshop results from earlier this spring. We'll then look at some case study interviews, the findings from those, and provide some considerations for further development as they relate to Grace Tippling Hall. We'll do a brief summary of what we heard from some key stakeholder interviews in and around Shelburne, and provide some closure and next steps recommendations for your consideration in the coming days and months. So as you likely all know, we're talking today about Grace Dublin Hall, which is the hall within the hall, which is to say the 195 seat theater that you have within your historic and heritage built town hall. We started this process looking at your community improvement plan from 2019 and trying to devise the ways in which new development or opportunities for enterprise within the hall might contribute to that plan. So around the sort of periphery of your flow chart here, you'll see that in terms of establishing the environment for change, developing the political will, long-term visions, and public sector investments, we're thinking of using Grace Tippling Hall and your August activities to develop and implement a long-term vision and commitment to this key public cultural asset as it comes to reducing the risk and the cost incumbent on this kind of investment. Essentially, we're looking at different ways of using this theater for providing some mixed public or private collaboration and investment, and indeed potentially a lever or focus for downtown pedestrians, and that over time through marketable image, critical mass, etc., future success in this regard will look more or less like an improved and sustainable heritage urban amenity promoting social prosperity and inclusion. So again, just to summarize, these are sort of how we were approaching the engagement and trying to figure out how to deliver these things for Shelburne in the long term. So to begin, we'll just look at some of the results from the preliminary workshop, the interviews and surveys we did. To begin, the participants were asked in the workshop to discuss the current state of Grace Tippling Hall according to 5 different asset areas based on the Sustainable Livelihoods Framework, and discussed how each of those assets could be leveraged, which would need special attention as the project unfolded. They were also asked to envision what improvements in each area might look like, and eventually to rate each asset area according to a numerical rating out of 5. This is a quick summary of the scoping survey we performed on the Shelburne On Your Own platform. We did get 20 responses, not as many as we might have hoped, but in general, participants were asked to whether they agreed or the extent to which they agreed with a series of positive statements reflecting on the various assets present in the hall. As it came to social networks and community, people were definitely agreeing that there was a strong social network and community in place around the hall. No one disagreed. Indeed, as we come to physical space and fixtures, somewhat less agreement. A few people definitely agreeing, but some people somewhat disagreeing. As far as financial resources, people were mostly undefined. We had the majority, or basically essentially half respondents saying they neither agreed nor disagreed that the financial resources were in place to support sustainable activities. Finally, with regard to the skills and experience of the people working in and around the hall, people were generally in agreement that those things were in place, a little bit of undetermined, and then that was the only place where we logged a definite disagreement with that statement. So rounding out the survey results with the workshop results, again in the workshop we had 14 participants from Shelburne, and that was complemented by a pilot delivery of that workshop materials with 3 individuals. And so on a scale of 1 to 5, the human assets within the hall and relating to it were rated at about a 3.0 in the workshop. For social assets, it was about a 2.5 based on the survey results. In addition, I might suggest that that might be closer to a 3.5 perhaps. As far as the sort of culture and identity generally attached to the hall, that was about a 2.5. We didn't, in fact, ask that specific question during the survey, just in the interest of brevity. But as it came to the physical or ecological status of the hall, that was rated in the workshop at about a 2.5. With we might think of that as maybe a plus or minus 1. It seems like that one's more of a range depending on people's opinion and understanding of the physical attributes. And then in terms of financial assets, we're looking at about a 2.5 as well. So in general, we summarize that as essentially, it seems like there's a good team in place, but there's definitely room to grow in many of these areas. Moving on to our case studies, we did look at a series of comparator theaters across Ontario starting with, of course, Theatre Orangeville, the nearest to you, with a capacity in their theater for 273 people. We also looked at Meaford Opera House with a capacity of 330. The Blythe Festival Theatre has 2 theaters, one with 360 capacity, the other with 160. The Port Dover Lighthouse Festival Theatre has a capacity of 250. Erin Theatre Co-op in Erin, Ontario has the capacity of 155, which was the smallest comparative we looked at. They are a film theatre only. And then the Opera House in Orillia, Ontario, which again has 2 theaters, one with a capacity of 607, the other 105. So we did reach out to all of these comparator sites and were successful in securing key stakeholder interviews from each of them. And so the balance of this portion of our presentation reports on what we found when we talked to them. As far as governance goes, we did observe a spectrum of financial and operational arrangements. Some of these theaters were fully municipal, which is to say that they were town operated by essentially city staff, and they were usually designed as revenue generating ventures, whether or not they in fact turned into the black each year. Some were more of what we would consider a hybrid model, which is to say there was substantial hands-on municipal involvement in some capacity or other, but there was also the presence of a standalone or arm's length nonprofit organization overseeing programming and or theatrical operations overall. Finally, a few of these sites were independents, which is to say that they were standalone nonprofit entities with where they existed purely financial arrangements with their home municipalities. So here we see which of those were which. So you can see Theatre Orangeville and Port Dover Lighthouse Festival Theatre are roughly in that mixed area, whereas Meaford Opera House and Orillia Opera House are definitely municipal run. And then Blythe Festival Theatre and Erin Theatre Co-op were the 2 independents we looked at. Again, we looked at and asked questions about all the different asset areas relating to the Sustainable Livelihoods Framework. And so focusing on governance, we did see that most included nonprofit organizations with programming and administration responsibilities, while the municipality would assist with facilities and maintenance where that occurred. Municipal support tended to account for as low as 15, but up to 50% of total operating budgets, and ongoing relationships to municipal governance often included designated municipal council members for nonprofit boards, quarterly and or annually reporting to the municipality regarding rental revenues, and then in some cases donating meeting space back to the council in order to perform and provide space for other municipal activities. I should have got myself a glass of water. Nonprofits say a number of benefits flowing from their model, which is to say the ability to access grants from provincial and federal arts and heritage agencies was attested to. The flexible ability to take on new theater or other auxiliary spaces as they arose was framed as a positive feature of this model, and further the ability to accept fundraising or other donations that the municipality itself might not be able to pursue, and indeed to maintain a strong independent brand identity in the regional and theater community, which is a thing that municipality might struggle to do under its own auspices. So as it comes to the physical assets, about half of the theaters we spoke with had undergone some extensive renovations within the last 10 years. And these tended to be outside of regular arrangements with their municipalities, which is to say the nonprofits themselves often took on debt or other investments to specifically fund capital replacement or expansion. Some stress the importance of an ongoing plan to maintain and update theatrical and technical AV equipment. And then even once state-of-the-art might be reached in those areas, replacing and updating those elements on essentially a 5-year rotating schedule was recommended by the case studies. So as it comes to sort of considerations and how this might affect your strategies within the Grace Tippling Hall, it is advised to incorporate regular technical and AV equipment update cycles within budgets, and indeed identify any currently needed or indeed next likely major renovations while developing a funding strategy for carrying those out. If possible, ensuring the greatest flexibility in space use will be needed, given that for the most part, many of the theaters had a whole host of rental offerings beyond the individual theater spaces so that people can come in and prepare light food or beverage service, provide areas for art exhibits, and generally hold other types of meetings where possible. Moving on to the uses of the spaces. In the case studies we spoke to, they defined events in many different ways, but most included generally in-house productions, as well as external rentals and roadhouse shows. So theaters hosted anywhere from 10 to about 60 events each month. And again, they had a variety of events in their spaces, including commissioned theater and repertory theater as well. Beyond that, of course, roadhouse shows, film screenings, community partnership productions, and private rentals were all normal uses of spaces within the case studies. The majorities use a seasonal approach whereby they would offer their commissioned or repertory theater offerings within a specific season. Often it was not winter, given that we're talking about rural Ontario theaters, and they focused on roadhouse or community events in their off season so that they would have revenue throughout the year and not be over-reliant on one season out of four. Most focused on either theatrical or musical productions, rarely both, which is to say that speccing the theater to focus on one of those would probably be advised. And beyond that, external rentals were provided as a year-round supplement and core community service offering. This is just a description of the various things that happened in those places in terms of what would be rented out and for what. As you can see, kitchens is in there and is not something that is currently possible within the current Grace Tippling Hall program, but as I'll come to later, was framed as a potential key offering for community stakeholders overall. Again, rentals incurred some staffing costs, and of course, were often seen as part of a community service mandate that included low-cost rental fee schemes, but in most cases, the direct staffing costs, which is to say essentially cleaning, technical, and forgetting the name now, but the person who brings you to your seat, those types of staffing costs were essentially usually incurred through case-by-case contract or casual labor, but that those were offered through the general daily rental structure, such that when an organization wanted to make use of those staffing complements, that they would pay the real cost for those at the point of sale. So theaters, of course, opted to stay closed during COVID-19. And then, so just in terms of how this might impact Grace Tippling Hall in general, it is considered that a new cultural organization or partnership could create a programming framework to help develop and deliver events in the space. But that is critical to identify what kind of auxiliary spaces are currently available and what might be needed or beneficial as operations grow or diversify. Here's a quick chart just breaking down the financial comparisons, looking at the year leading up to the COVID-19 pandemic, when all of these theaters were up and running at full capacity. You'll see at the far left, Grace Tippling Hall took in about $9,500 in revenue for an expense of, depending on how you assess it, the entire town hall cost about $261,000 per annum. And so if we think of Grace Tippling Hall as about half of that, it's at least $130,000 operating cost per year. You'll see, of course, that Meaford and Orillia and indeed Orangeville were operating at a modest deficit. Meaford and Orillia seems to be dealing with those ongoing deficits through interfund transfers within municipal budgets, such that their offerings are considered to be core services offered for all residents. And then you'll see Blythe and Erin turning a modest profit or surplus. Of course, Blythe being interesting amongst our comparators in that they are the only one which is providing substantial in-house new productions of and commissioning theater productions. This indicates why their budget is so much higher than the others, given that they are in fact quite a bit smaller than Orillia. So just as it comes to it, revenue and funding, the majority of organizations, as we said, are nonprofits or charities, and they're expected to operate as such on a break-even model. Their operating expenses range from about 200,000 to over 2 million, and the revenue similarly from about 250,000 to 2 million. Municipally run theaters are revenue generating ventures with, again, and surpluses nominally going back to the town. But indeed, those theaters tend to be directly funded by up to 50% of operational budgets, suggesting that they are considered more or less core offerings. And so the municipalities also partnered with nonprofits on the larger projects in unique arrangements depending on their context. All of them were in relatively good financial health pre-COVID, with budget variance rates up to about 10%. Two theaters of 5 had accrued operating surpluses within the last 5 years, but those were all exhausted, surprising no one, during COVID-19. So there are lots of different revenue streams that were identified, and many of our respondents focused on the need to have as many diverse revenue streams as possible. These included municipal funding arrangements in the main, as well as providing ticket surcharges for capital repair funds, seeking donations, providing subscriptions for patrons and local residents to increase cash flow and ensure that attendance is good. We also saw substantial grants coming in to many nonprofits, including operating grants, special project grants, other capital repairs, and indeed provincial or federal arts or heritage agencies. A few provided sponsorships or advertising channels that to the business community, especially Aaron Theatre, cited that as a key part of how they make ends meet. And then finally, fundraising committees were seen as instrumental in working on all of these things, and indeed providing annual fundraising initiatives for operating costs or to fund capital renovations. So again, ticket sales and rental incomes alone are not the majority revenue sources for many of these theaters. They rely heavily on donors, grants, subscribers, and municipal support. Here we can see we did some sort of expense and revenue modeling based on 3 potential governance models, the first being a municipal only. We assessed that in the first 3 years, you might see a capital contribution, which is to say a reduction in your overall operating budget from 27 to up to 34,000 and potentially down to 10,000 on the assumption that as operations scale up and you're offering more and more events, you may indeed have to be hiring additional staff into that cost center in order to provide that level of service. But at that point, we're really talking about, a couple of events every week in the hall. And so that you'd still be sort of modestly in the black, but generally we're looking at this as more or less the cost recovery capacity within the hall. So for the multi-use, this is sort of where we might think of assessing the capital contribution, assuming that we're more or less comfortable with providing about 60% of the overall cost within the town hall as sort of core offering, but then providing 40% of that 261,000 as an in-kind contribution as part of an ongoing partnership with either a new or an established incorporated nonprofit entity. So for this, we might see some increases in your ability to access grants and other investments with a corresponding increase in overall capital contribution. The final scenario is basically looking at whether it would be possible to simply rent out the hall for the year to a trusted new or indeed existing nonprofit entity and providing half of the operational cost in the theater as an in-kind contribution to that vendor, with the result of you taking in about $40,000 each year in rental fees. So as far as considerations for use within the hall, success will come likely from revenues that are as diverse as possible, and including a mixture of ticket sales, rental revenues, patron and partner support, grants, donations, and municipal support. Governance models supporting those diverse income streams should be prioritized. And then finally, cultivating a particular brand or identity within the hall and its theater offerings may be helpful indeed in reaching donors or patrons, locally and on a provincial and national scale, depending on what that area of interest is. So moving on, just to talk a bit about those different identities and brands, several theaters we spoke to did have those specific theatrical mandates, mostly around developing new Canadian theater, which is not surprising given the general context we're operating in. Of course, these mandates allowed them to have that particular identity within the Canadian theater ecosystem and to connect to provincial and national networks in a good way. Several theaters offered youth camps designed to engage young people through their mandate and generally garner some revenue through that type of programming as well. Potential avenues for cultivating a distinct and marketable theater identity today for Grace Tippling Hall could include commissioning theater by, for, or about newcomers, Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, local and emerging cultures of rurality, and then possibly developing a learning space for young theater professionals and students, providing opportunities for young people's theater more broadly, and indeed serving or having events for school groups, and finally a genre or niche repertory theater that might otherwise be underserved in Ontario. Finally, as we come to sort of audiences and community from the case studies, we did see that they were all located in small towns or cities below 30,000 population, but had large catchment areas. Local tourism was a key driver for sales and strategy overall. Weather was a key consideration for most, as I said, tending to suggest a spring or summer regular season. And for some theaters, building local community and integrating local sort of volunteer or other efforts was of high importance. For others, it was relatively low. Those with the higher community engagement worked with community partners in many ways, partnering with community groups, engaging local business, engaging community groups, and offering discounts for local residents. And then those several theaters also credited their strong volunteer cores with their success. And so from here, we're just talk a bit about overall priorities before startup of new operations within the hall. Ideally, identifying key stakeholders and partners should come first before building consensus amongst those parties on the best governance or operational structures to proceed with your vision. Building consensus on those programming priorities for the theater space as part of that governance operational discussion, and then planning for rehabilitation or renovation needs in Grace Tippling Hall to build suitable programming priorities. Finally, the financial strategy within the hall would be to your benefit and including diverse revenue streams wherever possible. I'll pause quickly here to run through what we did hear from the key stakeholders we did interview, which was 5 different individuals in this summer. So we talked to 6 people representing 5 different local organizations. All of them had some history of or possible use within the hall. And we tried to get from them a sense of their governance priorities as well as their fee tolerances, and also looked at how to improve the space to potentially make it more accessible or desirable as an event venue. In general, people really do like the hall and its heritage atmosphere. Most considered sound and lighting upgrades a priority. Some possible uses would need access to some different things that are not currently part of the program or are not suitable to what is needed. So an example might be soundproofing rehearsal spaces. We know that there are some ancillary spaces where people can sometimes rehearse, but it was framed that those rehearsals are audible when they are rehearsing, and thus makes it difficult for people to be rehearsing at the same time as there's something in being produced. Light food service, as I said, and flexible meeting spaces were also framed as desirable. And then access to in-house sound and lighting expertise, again, considered important and not something that the hall currently offers. But overall, respondents understood that hall rentals are very cheap under the current scheme, which is to say, right now, I believe you're charging less than $500 for full use of the hall, including the use of all sound and technical equipment therein. There was general enthusiasm amongst stakeholders for potential to use the hall more often, but ongoing or frequent use was constrained by access to those flexible spaces I just spoke about. Within the theater, the addition of dedicated light and sound control areas would also help, though this, of course, would need to be balanced against the potential for loss of seats within an already pretty restricted performance space. In terms of scoping the schedule of use within the hall, responses suggested that they might rent the hall 2 to 3 times a year under the present circumstances, that each event they would produce was likely to require no more than a day or two for setup or rehearsals. And indeed, a majority of respondents were interested in offering ticketed events, although in some cases there was hope to offer quote unquote free tickets for community celebrations or public performances. And so the true cost of those tickets would have to be borne by them or indeed by the town. So respondents were generally confident, however, in their ability to sell out tickets, whether they were talking about offering one-off ticketed events for a fee or indeed those sorts of free tickets, depending. Reflecting on the governance, we did frame those 3 governance possibilities. We introduced and described them to the respondents, that is to say municipal run, a more distributed partnership model, or an independent lease model. The municipal model was often framed as preferable because it was seen as the simplest or least disruptive change. It's not really uncommon that we find that. It's like, if we change very little, people seem to think that that's pretty much okay. 2 respondents suggested that they might be interested in being a primary leaseholder or substantial partner in producing or scheduling events going forward. And all respondents described some potential positive features of the partnership or collaborative model, and suggested that they would be interested in joining a group created by the municipality to explore these possibilities going forward. All of their names and information have been conveyed to your economic development department. As it came to tickets, rentals, pricing, respondents generally considered a $20 ticket attainable for amateur or student performances. Some suggested lower prices, of course, but $35 was considered the highest price conceivably or comfortably attainable for any performance in the space. In lieu of rental fees, respondents were most comfortable in the range of 10 to 30% for ticket commission, again, depending on what they would assess as the other event expenses they would have to cover. But as a flat rate, respondents were indicating single day prices from $500 to $1,000 as feasible. And then for annual leases, the idea of 50% of operations or maintenance was considered a potential, although in one case, a respondent suggested that essentially going on a sort of commission basis throughout the year would make it easier for them to consider that kind of substantial change in their own core operating. So for all there, we arrive at this sort of next steps on what this all means for Grace Tippling Hall, and some things for your August body to consider over the coming days, months, and indeed years. So the first being to decide on the governance or operational model to proceed with or toward. There is no reason necessarily to not offer the municipal only model to begin with the idea of expanding or creating a new partnership model in the coming years in order to access more programming grants and funding, which the municipality might struggle to acquire on its own. Integrating relevant community stakeholders in annual scheduling and programming processes should be prioritized so that the people in the community are the ones who are most benefiting from it. And then building consensus on the programming and rental priorities for the theater space with your stakeholders, developing a plan for rehabilitation and renovation needs to include auxiliaries or support diverse uses and revenue streams going forward. Finally, to set rental and ticket rates as part of developing a longer-term financial strategy that includes diverse revenue streams is recommended. That concludes my presentation. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to stay for questions.
Thanks, Emmett. But before we open it up to questions, I think Denise may want to make a few remarks just in terms of the staff report. It's Carol's report, but Carol wasn't able to join us tonight. So Denise, any additional comments?
Thank you, Mayor Mills. No, I just wanted to provide the general background that was in there. I'm sure council is aware that we received a grant through 2 participating partners to support the work that Emmett and his firm and his colleagues have undertaken, and thank you so much. We did outline some recommendations. Obviously, the standard one is that you receive it for information and that the presentation be received, but also that the options and the overview that Emmett and his colleagues have provided in the presentation be used as the guiding principles for not only capital, programming, and staffing for future annual budgets for the consideration of council. So ultimately, we would take this presentation and use it as our primary foundation for evaluating next steps and the continued consultation that's outlined. And then we're also going to be reporting back to the funding partners that the project at this point has been completed in this phase of it. And attached with the project is, or sorry, the report is a number of appendices. Obviously this presentation, as well as some links to the neighborhood design, which was fundamental in launching this, and also some of the other background that was critical to, I guess, integrating what the community said they were experiencing with opportunities that they saw for Grace Tippling Hall and what wasn't being provided. So that really was the extent of what the staff report was trying to convey.
Thank you. Questions for Emmett and Denise, Deputy Mayor Anderson?
Yeah, thanks for the presentation and thanks, Mayor Mills. First of all, I agree with the municipality playing a major role in getting this off the ground. I could certainly see opportunities to partner with organizations, as we talked about, sort of trusted organizations like Streams, for example, as a possibility. But I certainly do believe that the municipality should be taking the lead. And I know that Councillor Bernardo has been championing this cause and carrying the baton on this about, hiring somebody or having a designated person, whether it's on some bonus structure, or whatever incentive, whatever the case may be. But certainly agree with that. But here's my question, though. And by the way, I also appreciated seeing the diverse opportunities that exist for Grace Tippling Hall. So whether that's special screenings, etc., those were helpful as well. But when it came to the report, one of the things I was hoping to see as you took us through the different theaters that exist, obviously you've spoken to a few of these individuals that are operating these facilities, is what are they projecting by way of the use and revenue post COVID-19, or as we're sort of transitioning in the space that we're in right now? Are they looking at doing business differently? Do they have concerns? Because that may help guide us as to what we do during this time period. Because one of the things that you talked about was the fact that those who had surpluses have either eaten through those surpluses or they've been evaporated, right? And so what are their concerns, if any, moving forward? Are they looking to scale things back? Are they looking to do different things with the spaces? Have they heard some, back from the community with respect to, we're not sure if we want to come back to a space that's so enclosed? And I touch on that lastly, just I touch on that because our CEO talked about the desire for outdoor spaces because of COVID-19. More people want to be outdoors than indoors. And I'm just wondering whether that's going to have some sort of impact on the usage of a space like this. So those are my comments. Thank you.
Emmett, did you get any sense from any of the case studies you looked at as to kind of what they're looking at in the post-COVID environment?
Thank you, Mayor Wells. Thank you, Deputy Mayor Anderson. So it was somewhat difficult to approach that question, given that we were offering these interviews over the summer when it was still, we're just starting to get sort of vaccinations and things like that. We did hear from some of the respondents that many of them had performed quite substantial retrofits within their facilities as COVID was beginning in order to ensure that there was, appropriate air filtration and other amenities provided. And so as it comes to moving beyond COVID and both the public health and just generally the psychological orientation of people in terms of approaching this kind of public space, I think we're likely to see sort of things happen on both ends of that continuum, which is to say some people wanting to be in a more distanced situation, less likely to be wanting to attend things that are quite a bit busier or where they do have less personal space. or indeed doing things outside. On the reverse of that, I think people are hungry for live performances. I think they're hungry for a return to some new social arts engagements. And so whether they are doing so in the same quantities or at the same times is definitely open to question. But I mean, I think like in general, as it came to forecasting for our overall revenues, we were not assuming that, you know, every event would be at 195 capacity. In fact, that's very rare in any theater situation in general. So, you know, accommodating for that type of essentially what we would call a vacancy loss in the housing department, right, is very much sort of part of that ongoing budgeting suggestion. Just to make sure that you are offering many events, but not necessarily expecting that you're going to have a full house every time. So within that sort of possibly more limited rollout or startup in the next few years, considering sort of incorporating, you know, a nominal 100-seat capacity might give you some additional information. And yeah, I'm happy to possibly go back and provide a different scenario within the overall sort of budget framework we have laid out to provide exactly for that possibility. Thank you, Deputy Mayor.
No problem. I think that would be, in my view, I think that would be helpful. One of the things I saw on television recently was, I don't know if it was the Opera House. I mean, certainly you're right. There was a thirst for people to come back to the theater, but one of the adjustments that they made was not to obviously have the maybe full capacity. And the other was, and I've gone to a number of places, I'm sure many people here have as well, but to skip the intermissions, for example. So to make it shorter so that you're not in that enclosed space for 1 hour or 2 hours or 3 hours, but they've made it more condensed to sort of get people in and out. And so I was just wondering, again, sort of what people were thinking who are already running these spaces and running them in some situations successfully. But so if you could provide some insight on that, I think that would help us as to maybe how we go about navigating and communicating to the public that it is safe to return because we're taking certain measures that are consistent with what other people are doing as well. Thank you.
All right, anybody else? No? Okay. So the motion we have in the agenda is to receive report LS 2021-13 from, sorry, wrong one. To receive report EDC 2021-02 regarding Grace Tippling Hall revitalization and feasibility project for information. And the council receives the Grace Tippling Hall feasibility study presentation from Emmett Ferguson, and that the options and considerations from the Grace Tippling Hall feasibility study be used to guide future capital programming and staffing resources and be included in future annual budgets for the consideration of council. Mover and seconder for that, moved by Councillor Bernardo, seconded by Councillor Hall. Any further discussion on that? All in favor? It's carried. Thank you, Emmett. Enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thanks very much, all. Have a pleasant evening. Bye.
Okay, so the last report is from the clerk regarding the appointment of a private security company for parking enforcement. Jennifer.
Thank you. And through your worship, just a very high level overview. As noted on November 8th through report LS 2021-12, the town has engaged the services of a private contractor as a stopgap measure for the 2021-2022 winter parking season. And in order to be able to perform parking enforcement, these folks through the Police Services Act are required to be appointed by the town. And so accordingly noted under the financial impact section, we have budgeted for this in the 2021 budget, and there is provisions within the 2022 budget to provide for these services. And presented to you tonight is the bylaw to appoint these folks so that they can get started with our winter parking enforcement.
Questions for Jennifer? Deputy Mayor?
Yeah, thanks. I guess my thought process, I mean, I saw in the report that some municipalities are using this stopgap measure, as you put it, on a temporary, some maybe even on a permanent basis. And I think the budget was about 10,000 and change for this temporary measure. If we get to the point where we do hire the junior bylaw officer, would it be fair to assume that this would not be a cost that we would have to incur moving forward?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, thank you.
Anything else? Okay. Can I get a mover and seconder then to receive the report and to provide the reading and enacting of bylaw number 66-2021, which is a bylaw to appoint TAG International Inc., operating as TAG Security Services, as the parking enforcement officers for a period covering November 15th, 2021 to April 16th, 2022. Moved by Councillor Hall, seconded by Councillor Fegan. Anything further on that? All in favor? It's carried. Okay, any notices of motion for this evening? Okay, on to communications then. Any items there that anybody wants to discuss? Councillor Wagner?
Yes, thank you so much, Mayor Mills. I just have two that I'd like to pull out. The first one is number 4. So it's just the BIA's minutes. I just wanted to make sure that anyone who was watching is aware that the BIA has decided to move forward with the Santa Claus Parade this year, which obviously is wonderful news. You know, having some sense of normal back in the town, and hopefully it will lift the morality of people and, you know, boost that. So I just wanted to say that it's going to be held December the 4th at 6 p.m. There is some social media information on the BIA's Facebook page that states the new route because of certain circumstances. So if the community could take note of that there is a new route for 2021, and any parking restrictions and road closures, obviously, as well. There will be Santa photos from 4 till 5:30. I do believe that is usually held at Jack Darling Park, so I would assume it will continue there. Maybe Councillor Buffett can confirm that. And there will also be a tree lighting ceremony at 5:30 p.m. that day, and all day shopping with the downtown shops, where hopefully they'll be offering some sales and initiatives and whatnot to get people into their stores. So yeah, if anyone wants to be a participant in the parade, anyone can. You can have your own float, and there is certain requirements that you have to fulfill, of course. So you are requested to email the BIA directly, and they will send you a registration form along with the information that you need to know in order to be a participant. There is a theme, which I don't know if, again, Councillor Buffett can sort of let you know. I can't remember what the theme is. So yeah, so I just wanted to kind of pull that forward and just make sure that people are aware that we are heading back into some events slowly but surely. My second correspondence I'd like to pull out is number 7. And I'd like to support the City of Kitchener with their request to the Ford government to extend the reduced red tape to provide patios for our local establishments so that they can continue recouping revenue losses over this challenging COVID time. I think that just as a council, you know, anything that we can do to help our local businesses sort of recoup and recover, we should try and do. So I do believe the red tape was supposed to sort of come back into effect, I guess you could say, at the beginning of 2022. So if we could, you know, send a letter in support of that in order to hopefully, you know, continue moving forward with an easier process for processing, you know, permits and accepting, you know, that ability to provide food and beverages on the patio. I think that would set a strong message to our local businesses that we support them.
Okay, great. So Councillor Wagner has made a motion to support the motion from the City of Kitchener. Is there a seconder for that? Councillor Fegan? Any discussion on that one? All in favor? That's carried. Okay, excellent. Thank you. Anybody else for communications? Okay. Can I just get a general motion then to receive those items listed as communications? Councillor Hall, seconded by Deputy Mayor Anderson. All in favor? It's carried. No closed session, so just a motion for the confirming bylaw. Councillor Hall, seconded by Councillor Fegan. All in favor? Carried. And just before we adjourn, just a quick reminder that next Monday night at 6:30, we're going to have a special meeting for the budget framework. So same time, so hopefully that doesn't inconvenience anybody. And Carrie, how long do you think it will be? I mean, I'm sure that probably depends largely on how many questions we have, but your best guess.
Probably an hour at least.
Yeah. Okay. Excellent. All right. So with that, can I get a motion to adjourn? Councillor Bernardo, seconded by Councillor Hall. All in favor? Carried. All right. Well, everybody cuddle in tonight and watch the snowstorm.